When we look at the ancient Celtic world through a modern lens, one thing becomes clear. Death was never the end of the story. Burial customs tell us a great deal. The Celts placed grave goods beside the dead, and in some cases even sacrificed wives or slaves at a tomb. That alone does not automatically prove ancestor worship. But when such practices continue for generations, they take on the shape of a structured belief system. Add to that the deep respect shown to burial mounds and heroic graves, and a larger picture emerges. The dead were not forgotten. They were remembered, feared, honoured, and sometimes actively worshipped. The severed heads of enemies were offered to powerful ancestral spirits, the strong shades of tribal heroes, whose deeds were preserved in song. When those heads were displayed on houses, they may have been dedicated to family spirits, guardians of the household. Even kings were linked to sacred burial sites. Some were inaugurated atop ancestral cairns. Certain gods were tied directly to ancient barrows. The boundary between hero, ancestor, and divinity was fluid. The heart of this belief system was not just the grave, it was the hearth. In some regions, the dead were even buried near the home fire. The idea that ancestral spirits gathered around the hearth survived long after paganism faded. In Brittany, people believed the dead returned at night to warm themselves by the fire. On the eve of All Souls, food was left out for them. Over time, the ancestral spirit transformed in folklore into the household brownie, the puka, the lutin, a helpful but mysterious presence tied to the home. What had once been the honoured ghost of an ancestor slowly became a fairy being. Archaeology supports this connection. Clay hearth supports decorated with rams' heads have been found in Celtic Gaul. The ram was already linked to sacrifice and fire rituals. It appears on tombs and in underworld imagery. It seems likely that the ram symbol represented offerings made to the spirits of the dead at the family fire. Even serpents carved with ram heads appear in monuments of underworld gods, blending symbols of earth, death, and sacrifice. The dead were not only remembered, they were fed. Food and drink were placed at graves and left in homes. In Ireland, nuts were placed in coffins. In parts of France and Brittany, milk was poured onto graves. In Scotland and Brittany, the dead were believed to attend funeral feasts. These are not isolated superstitions. They are echoes of a once-living system in which the dead remained members of the community. Even roadside cairns raised where violent deaths occurred may have served to calm restless spirits. Passers-by adding a stone were participating in an ancient act of appeasement. Now let's turn to the larger public gatherings. In Ireland, annual assemblies were held to commemorate deceased kings and chiefs. These events were not just memorials, they became major fairs for trade, politics, and celebration. Many were tied to seasonal festivals like Lugnasad or Samhain. Some legends claim these festivals began in memory of a foster mother or fallen ruler. But behind the story may lie something deeper. Lugnasad was a harvest festival. It may once have involved the symbolic or literal sacrifice of a representative of the corn spirit. Over time, when the old ritual faded, memory attached the festival to a named figure, a goddess or king, transforming agricultural sacrifice into heroic commemoration. The belief that observing the festival brought abundance, while neglect brought famine, hints at an older fertility rite. Beneath the surface, the most powerful moment in the Celtic calendar for remembering the dead came at Samhain, the beginning of winter and the turning of the year. This was the season when vegetation appeared to die. Yet evergreen plants, mistletoe, and the preserved sheaf of last harvest suggested that life still lingered in hidden form. At this liminal moment, the dead were believed to draw near. Perhaps the spirits of sacrificed fertility representatives were thought to return. Perhaps winter's arrival itself symbolized the descent into the underworld. Whatever the origin, Samhain became the night when the boundary between worlds thinned. Food was laid out. Fires burned bright. In Brittany, a massive log blazed in the hearth. This may connect to the later Yule log tradition, domestic fire rituals echoing the great public bonfires of Samhain. There are striking parallels across Europe. In Scandinavia, the dead were linked to female earth spirits. Among the Celts, fertility goddesses known as the matres appear to play a similar role. Over time, male underworld gods replaced earlier earth goddesses, but the connection between death, fertility, and the land endured. The beginning of winter became both the end of one cycle and the start of another, a new year born in darkness. With the spread of Christianity, these older traditions were not erased overnight. The feasts of All Saints and All Souls were introduced in early November, likely in part to redirect existing practices. Yet the older beliefs never fully disappeared. Even today, in parts of Ireland and Brittany, food is still set out on November Eve. Fires are still lit. The memory of Samhain survives beneath later layers of religion. In the Celtic imagination, the dead were not silent shadows. They were present, at the hearth, at the harvest, at the turning of the year. They guarded the tribe, demanded respect, and were woven into the rhythms of land and season. Death was not separation, it was transformation, and the story continued on the other side of the firelight. In the earliest layers of human belief, the world was alive, the earth, the sea, the wind, the sun, the moon. None of these were abstract forces, they were beings. Not symbols, not metaphors, but personalities in their own right. Over time, these living forces became more clearly defined as gods or spirits separate from the physical elements themselves. Yet, even after named deities emerged, people continued to revere nature directly. Mountains, rivers, wells, groves, they were still approached as sacred presences. Early Christian writers complained about this constantly. They warned people not to pray to hills or fountains, not to call the sun and moon divine. But those warnings reveal something important. Nature worship was deeply rooted. The ordinary people, the villagers and farmers, still believed that divine powers filled every valley, river mouth, and woodland. The world was not empty space. It was inhabited. Old poetic invocations preserve this worldview. Before battle or before undertaking something dangerous, a leader might call upon the land itself, the shining sea, fertile mountains, wooded valleys, abundant rivers, lakes full of fish. These were not decorative words, they were direct appeals to living powers embedded in the landscape. Even after destruction or catastrophe, survivors would address water and earth in reverent, almost liturgical language, as if greeting conscious beings. Oaths were sworn by the elements, by earth, sun, fire, moon, sea, day, and night. Breaking such an oath meant the elements themselves would punish you. Even gods in legend swore by these forces. Long after official paganism faded, people were still warned not to swear by the sun or moon. In some regions of Brittany, people continued doing it anyway. These habits point back to a time when the elements were not just created things. They were divine powers. But it didn't stop at the great forces of nature. The Celts imagined the world filled with lesser spirits, beings of rocks, forests, glens, rivers, lakes, and fields. Even after larger gods of fertility and growth developed, smaller spirits remained. Some survived into folklore as fairies seen in meadows or woodland paths. Others took on darker forms, goblins, glen spirits, or unsettling figures haunting lonely places. In older stories, these beings sometimes aid heroes. In other tales, they must be fought or driven away. Over time, as Christianity reshaped the worldview, many of these nature spirits were reinterpreted as demons or fallen angels. But their roots are older, tied to landscape and place. Religious authorities tried to stamp out these practices. They forbade offerings at trees and stones. They condemned lighting candles at wells or crossroads. They outlawed incantations addressed to rivers or groves. They banned seasonal dances and ecstatic rituals. They denounced those who claimed to raise storms. Yet suppression never meant total disappearance. The old rites adapted. They survived under new names. A sacred well became a saint's well. A grove became associated with a Christian legend. In remote valleys and coastal villages, older beliefs persisted quietly. One of the most powerful natural forces in early Celtic life was the moon. Long before people carefully tracked solstices and equinoxes, they observed the moon's phases. It became an early calendar. Months and even years were counted by the moon. Night was thought to precede day. Festivals did not begin at sunrise. They began the evening before, when the moon rose. The moon's waxing and waning shaped agricultural life. A waxing moon meant growth. Seeds were sown then to encourage increase. Magical plants were gathered under its growing light to strengthen their power. A waning moon meant decline. Timber was cut then to avoid excess moisture. Livestock slaughtered at the wrong phase was believed to spoil. Even childbirth and conception were thought to be influenced by the moon's cycle. These beliefs were not random superstitions. They grew from sympathetic logic. The moon grows and shrinks, therefore, it must influence all growth and decay on Earth. In some regions, full moon dances were held before houses. People bowed to the new moon. Prayers were whispered to it. Even into Christian times, people addressed sun and moon directly, asking for protection and wholeness. Eclipses caused panic. People believed a monster attacked the moon and tried to drive it off with shouting. Laws were passed to stop crowds from yelling encouragement to the moon during an eclipse, yet the shouting continued. The sea, too, was alive. It was not merely water, it was a presence, sometimes hostile, sometimes compassionate. There are accounts of warriors advancing against rising tides with weapons drawn, as if confronting an enemy. Some saw this as ritual sacrifice. Others saw it as a belief that the waves themselves were living beings that could be challenged. Stories tell of heroes striking the tide with axes to hold it back. In other legends, the sea mourns the dead, groaning and wailing like a living creature. Certain waves had names and personalities. The ninth wave was especially powerful, sometimes protective, sometimes healing. The wind carried similar power. It punished oath breakers. It could be personified as a god worshipped by sailors. Druids and priestesses were believed to control it. Later, Christian writers claimed storm makers summoned demons to raise in tempests, and even spoke of aerial ships travelling through the sky. Beneath these accusations lies an older belief, that the sky and winds were ruled by conscious powers. What we see in all this is not a simple list of gods, but a worldview. A world where land and sea were aware, where hills could bless or curse, where wind carried intention, where moonlight shaped harvest and birth, where forests whispered with spirits. When official religion changed, these beliefs did not vanish. They shifted shape. They hid beneath Christian language. They survived in lullabies, proverbs, charms, and seasonal customs. Eventually, education and modern rationalism weakened them further. But echoes remain. Water was one of the most powerful sacred forces in Celtic life. We can see it from every angle. What ancient writers noticed, what people carved into stone, what they tossed into springs, and what still survived in folk customs long after Christianity arrived. Some scholars argue that this passion for wells and rivers came from older, pre-Celtic communities, and the Celts simply inherited it. Even if that's partly true, the Celts clearly embraced it with real intensity. Wherever they settled, they didn't just tolerate local water traditions, they blended them into their own. And in many places they treated new rivers and springs as if they belonged to the same divine world they already knew. There are dramatic stories that show how serious people were about sacred water. Near Toulouse, a treasure was thrown into a holy lake to end a plague. Later, when a Roman leader had the treasure hauled out for profit, he was said to die soon after in battle, almost like the water itself punished him for stealing what had been dedicated. At another lake, a multi-day festival involved throwing food, cloth, and offerings into the water and sacrificing animals. Then, as the story goes, the weather would break with thunder and heavy rain, like the lake answered the ceremony with raw power. And in the Christian period we keep seeing the same pattern. A saint confronts a spirit of the spring, drives it away, and the old sacred well gets rebranded as a healing well under the saint's protection. The place stays holy, only the name on the sign changes. If you look at inscriptions across Celtic lands, you find the rivers and springs treated almost like people you can thank, bargain with, or ask for help. Some are addressed with divine titles: goddess, august, sacred. And the number of named water goddesses is striking. Springs and wells especially are linked to female figures, while certain famous healing waters are linked to gods. In many places, rivers are explicitly she, and the divine personality behind the water is imagined as a giver of life, health, and abundance. People even formed personal names that claimed descent from a river, which hints at a belief that water spirits could unite with humans and produce legendary bloodlines. Another pattern is how the same divine river name appears again and again in different regions. That suggests something important. As Celtic groups moved, they may have recognized new rivers as part of the same sacred reality, almost as if the divine presence of water wasn't limited to one location. A river could be the divine one in many places because the holiness of water itself was the constant. Some river names may even preserve older, pre-Celtic language beneath the later Celtic layer, which fits the idea of adoption and blending. Healing was one of the biggest reasons people came to sacred waters. Imagine a spring sanctuary as a kind of ancient healing station or pilgrimage hotspot. People travelled there, left gifts, and performed a set ritual. In Roman-era Gaul, worshippers offered coins, ingots, and small models of body parts: hands, feet, eyes, limbs, anything that hurt or needed curing. The logic was simple and powerful. If you place a model of your sick body part in the presence of the water spirit, the real body part will recover. It's sympathetic magic, but it also functions like a religious vow. I came, I offered, I asked. And these places weren't quiet little puddles in the woods. They could draw crowds. Some had festivals. Some had priests or caretakers. Some became permanent shrines with inscriptions fixed to the walls or dropped into the water. People wrote requests directly to the water or its spirit. Heal me, make the spring flow, let it rise again. The language often blurs the line between the water itself and the divine being behind it, which tells you how strongly people felt that the water was alive. Even after official paganism faded, the spirits didn't vanish. They changed costumes. The old nymphs became fairies in later stories. Wells became holy wells. The rituals survived, sometimes almost unchanged. People still went sunwise around the well, a video-friendly way to say walking clockwise, kept silent, knelt, prayed, drank, washed, and left an offering. They might tie a strip of cloth to a tree near the well, part gift, part magical transfer. The cloth had touched the sick person, now it was left behind so the illness could be left behind too. Or so healing could keep flowing to the person even after they went home. Coins and pins were dropped into the water for the same reason. An offering, yes, but also a way to hand off the problem to the well. In some places, people believed that taking water without leaving something in return was dangerous, because the well demanded payment. Water spirits could also be asked for more than healing. Some wells were visited by women seeking fertility, drinking, bathing, praying, leaving gifts, asking the spirit, or later, the saint, for a child, easy childbirth, or plentiful milk. Other wells were treated like oracle spots. Bubbles, water level, the way an object floated or sank, or how a sacred animal moved. These were read as signs. A cure was coming, or it wasn't. A lover would be faithful, or not. Animals often represented the spirit of a spring. The most common was a fish, especially an eel or salmon. Some wells were famous for sacred fish that could not be caught. If one died, it might even be buried like a holy thing and replaced by another, as if the sacred presence had to continue unbroken. In Irish tradition, the salmon becomes a symbol of wisdom. Eat the salmon, gain knowledge. That may preserve an older idea. Sometimes the sacred animal wasn't only protected, it was ritually eaten by those who had the right, turning divine power into human insight. But water had a darker face too. Alongside beautiful well-dwellers and helpful spirits, Celtic regions also preserved stories of river monsters and lake predators. Sometimes these feel like older gods turned frightening under later religious pressure. Sometimes they feel like ancient guardian myths, serpents and dragons that control access to deep water. In the Highlands you get the water horse, a slick, web-footed shapeshifter that lures people onto its back and drags them into the loch. In other places there's the water bull. Wales has its own lake monsters. France has river beings that pull victims down. These tales differ in tone, but they all circle the same fear. Water is powerful, and it has owners. There are also strong hints, especially in folk rhymes and recurring legends, that certain rivers were believed to demand a yearly toll of human lives. Sometimes a voice is said to call out once a year, as if the old payment is overdue. Whether or not this reflects real sacrifice everywhere, the idea is consistent. If you neglect a sacred power, it doesn't become harmless, it becomes hungry. Finally, you get warning stories that explain why some wells were taboo or dangerous. A woman approaches a forbidden well, walks around it the wrong way, insults it, breaks the rules, and the water rises and destroys her, becoming a great river. Another seeker goes to a wisdom well and is overwhelmed by the flood. These aren't just myths about how a river began. They read like cautionary tales about ritual boundaries. Do it properly, at the right time, in the right way, or the well will punish you. And in some communities, a well wasn't just sacred, it was managed. A woman caretaker might instruct visitors on the correct steps, collect gifts, and oversee the ritual. That detail is important. It shows these places weren't random superstitions, but organised sacred sites with living tradition. Even in the modern era, the old system didn't disappear. It shifted into new forms. Some wells became cursing wells, where people tried to harm an enemy by dropping a pin or written name into the water, paying the caretaker and letting the well spirit do the rest. It's dark, but it shows the same underlying belief. The water is alive, it listens, and it acts. The Celts didn't just respect trees as part of the landscape. They treated certain trees and whole forests as living sacred territory. and wherever they settled, they didn't hesitate to adopt older local traditions too. In the Pyrenees and southern Gaul, inscriptions and images hint at divine trees and even groups of trees treated as holy, like a cluster you would recognize as special because it stood alone, towered above everything else, or had some strange presence that people felt rather than explained. In other places, entire forests were imagined as having a single ruling goddess, almost like the woodland had a name, a face, and a personality of its own. Elsewhere, it wasn't one queen of the forest, but a whole crowd of unseen tree spirits, an oak wood full of presences, not a single figure. To understand how intense this could get, picture the kind of sacred grove that ancient writers describe. Dark, dense, and intentionally set apart from ordinary life. People didn't just pray there, they left things behind. Offerings were hung from branches. In the harshest forms, even human victims were displayed or sacrificed at trees, because the tree wasn't just wood and leaves, it was treated as a doorway, a home for powers linked to growth, fate, and the invisible world. And what looks shocking to us fits the logic of the old belief. If the tree holds life force, then whatever you attach to it, gifts, trophies, even the heads of enemies, becomes part of a transaction with the spirit inside the grove. One tree stood above all the rest in Celtic sacred thinking, the oak. Ancient observers said the Druids preferred oak woods for their ceremonies and used oak branches as a standard ritual tool. Even language preserves the idea. Old Irish tradition could use oak as a word that overlaps with divine. But the oak likely wasn't sacred first because it was a sky god symbol. It probably started as something much older and simpler, survival. Oaks were everywhere, they lived long, they sheltered people, they fed communities through acorns in hard times, they burned well, and they looked almost immortal compared to human life. In a world where life force felt like a real substance, the oak became a natural container for it. From there, a bigger idea grows. If the oak stores power, you can release that power at key moments. That helps explain why fire rituals mattered so much. Midsummer fires weren't just celebration, they were like a public recharge of nature's battery. Oak wood goes into the flames, and sometimes the tradition even hints at something more extreme. A stand-in for the spirit of growth, symbolically connected to tree life, being destroyed so that the land, animals, and people could thrive. Over time, later societies translated that older fertility logic into the language of high gods, so the oak could end up associated with a bright, ruling deity. But the older layer, the oak as the living heart of growth and endurance, never fully disappeared. The oak wasn't alone. Other trees carried their own reputations. Yew, ash, alder, hazel, rowan, thorn. In Ireland especially, certain trees were treated as charged with power, good for protection, dangerous to insult, and useful in ritual. Rowan fires, for example, appear in stories as a kind of magical counter-attack, lit with spoken charms to break an enemy's strength. And even centuries later, people kept the habit of using rowan, thorn, and elder near homes to ward off harm, because those trees were thought to host a protective presence that hostile forces avoided. Ireland also preserved the idea of the bile, a great sacred tree rooted in a specific place, often near a fort or a holy well. These weren't casual landmarks, they were identity markers. Their lives were tied to kings and communities. People gathered under them for major public moments, especially leadership rituals. That's why destroying a rival group's sacred tree wasn't just vandalism, it was spiritual warfare. Even in relatively late periods, accounts describe the cutting down of a famous sacred tree as an act that felt monstrous, followed by the expectation that punishment would come. Some stories go further and warn that burning even a fragment of such a tree could bring fire on your house, because the wood was too loaded with power to be treated as ordinary fuel. This tree world also shows up in names. Some tribal names and personal names look like they originally meant people of the yew, son of the oak, son of the alder, and so on. At first that can sound like poetry, but it may preserve something older. Clans identifying themselves with a sacred tree, or claiming descent from a tree spirit, or using the tree as a symbolic ancestor. Even when those meanings faded and the names became ordinary, they still echo a time when the connection felt literal. There's another layer too: trees and the dead. Across Celtic regions, you find strong taboos around trees growing near graves and burial places. The simplest idea is also the strongest. The dead person's spirit lives in the tree, or the tree becomes the dead person's living extension. That's why you get stories of lovers' graves, sprouting trees whose branches reach toward each other, sometimes even shaped like faces. It's not just romantic imagery. It's the belief that life continues, rooted in wood and leaf. And that belief survives in later folk fear. Don't cut cemetery trees. Don't break their branches. Don't steal a leaf, because you're interfering with the boundary between worlds. When Christianity spread, this kind of tree religion was stubborn. Church councils condemned it again and again. Stop tying offerings to trees. Stop lighting candles by them. Stop treating certain trees as untouchable. But the old habits stayed because they were woven into daily life. Healing, protection, fertility, luck. Often the church compromised rather than winning outright. A sacred tree that once held a god image might later hold a Madonna image instead, and legends would grow up claiming the image was discovered there, miraculously. The location remained holy, the story around it simply changed. And then there's the most famous tree ritual of all: mistletoe. Pliny describes a Druid ceremony where mistletoe, rare, high in the branches, was cut with a golden sickle, caught in a white cloth and paired with the sacrifice of white bulls. Pliny focuses on the mistletoe as a universal healing plant and a fertility charm, but the scale of the ritual feels bigger than medicine. It looks like a public sacred performance tied to growth and renewal. The moon is carefully timed, purity rules are strict, sacrifice is central, and the gift isn't just the plant, it's the prosperity of the community's life cycle. Pliny also mentions other power plants, gathered with strict rules: no iron, clean clothing, washed feet, fasting, silence, don't look back. This is a familiar pattern in ancient magic worldwide. The plant has power because a spirit is in it, so you approach it like a living being, not an object. You take it only under rules, often with an offering, and the ritual itself is part of what makes the plant effective. Celtic storytelling keeps this logic alive too. Fairy herbs restoring beauty, healing plants closing wounds, divine physicians reviving the dead with magical mixtures. Whether you read these as literal beliefs or as mythic storytelling, the underlying worldview is consistent. Nature is inhabited, responsive, and negotiable, if you know the right way to approach it. By the time we can clearly see the Celts in historical sources, the old animal worship, plain and simple, had mostly faded. Animals were no longer treated as gods you prayed to every day. Instead, they usually showed up as powerful signs, emblems that pointed to a god, or animals that carried a god's presence. But if you look closely, you can still catch the older layers underneath, scraps of earlier cults, stories that preserve the memory of animal divinities, and even hints of totem-style thinking, where a group believed it was tied by blood or fate to a specific creature. Let's start with the bull, because it keeps breaking the surface everywhere. One famous image from Paris shows a bull linked with 3 cranes placed right alongside major gods on an altar. That's not the kind of animal you carve for decoration. It reads like the bull is either divine in itself or the key figure in a sacred story everyone recognised. In Irish tradition, the most famous cattle tale is built around bulls that behave like beings with destinies, almost like they're more than animals. They aren't just strong, they carry histories, identities, even transformations. That matters because Celtic stories usually reserve reincarnation-style arcs for gods and legendary heroes. So when bulls get that treatment, it's a clue that they once belonged to the divine category. You also find bulls stamped onto coins and shown with strange extra features, like multiple horns, that look like visual shorthand for "this isn't an ordinary beast." Even names preserve the idea. People could be named in ways that essentially mean divine bull, as if the animal carried sacred prestige. And across the Celtic world, place names built around bull suggest that certain locations were once tied to bull myths, or bull worship, later reinterpreted as local legend. Then there's the boar and the swine, which are everywhere in Celtic art and story. The boar appears on standards, coins, and altars, and in some cases it's portrayed with extra horns, again, like a symbol of supernatural status. Yet you also see the transition happening. Instead of the boar as god, you start getting the boar as the companion of a goddess, likely linked with fertility or abundance. In other words, the animal begins to function like an icon, something that identifies a divine power, rather than being the divine power itself. Meanwhile, older rules still echo in strange ways. Some Celtic groups avoided eating pork, which feels like a taboo left over from an earlier stage when the animal was sacred. Elsewhere, especially in Irish tradition, pigs become central to legendary feasts and endless food stories, which may preserve the memory of sacrificial meals where eating the animal was not casual meat consumption, but a ritual act, consuming divine vitality. You also get mythic wild boars hunted by heroes, which may be folk memory of an older boar divinity recast into adventure storytelling. The serpent is another strong case. In Celtic religious images, a horned serpent appears in settings that clearly mark it as sacred. Sometimes it's shown beside a horned god, suggesting an underworld or earth-linked power. The serpent as a chthonic creature, the horn as a stamp of divinity. There are also story world traces, strange multi-headed serpents, and otherworldly reptiles seen during journeys beyond the human realm. Whether or not every detail connects neatly, the pattern is consistent. Serpents aren't random monsters in this mindset. They're carriers of deep earth power, and they sit close to the boundary between life and death. Now here's the big shift. Across multiple animals you can watch a repeated transformation. The animal starts as sacred in its own right, then becomes linked to a named deity, and finally the deity becomes human-shaped, while the animal survives as a symbol. The bear is a clean example. In places whose names even mean bear, you find a goddess receiving offerings with a bear beside her, like the older bear cult has been translated into a new form. The bear is still present, but now it points to the bear goddess. The same thing happens with the stag. The animal seems to slide into the image of a horned god. The stag's link to grain eating, forests, and seasonal cycles makes it easy to imagine it first as a living emblem of the life force in the fields, then later tied to an underworld or earth god, the hidden realm where growth is believed to originate. The horse is even more dramatic because its cult became widespread. Once you start seeing a horse goddess, protector of stables, breeders, and cavalry, You're looking at a society where the horse is economically and militarily crucial. Yet her imagery keeps one foot in older religion. She's not just patron saint of horses. She's surrounded by foals, feeding them, or shown with mare and foal motifs that feel like fertility symbolism in its purest form. Her worship spreads with mounted soldiers across the Roman world. But the roots feel older. A time when the horse itself was sacred, possibly not eaten except in ritual, and offered in major seasonal ceremonies connected with prosperity for the whole community. Later, folklore still preserves flickers of this. Midsummer horses, horse-headed disguises, water horses, prophetic horses, like broken reflections of a sacred animal that never fully stopped haunting the imagination. And then we get to the hardest, but most revealing, layer: totem-style thinking. You see it in several kinds of evidence. First, there are names that literally mean things like son of the bear, son of the raven, born of the dog, or people of the tree. Even if later generations treated these as poetic surnames, the structure points back to a worldview where claiming descent from an animal or plant wasn't absurd, it was meaningful identity. Second, there are taboos, rules that forbid a person from eating or harming a certain animal, with the story insisting that breaking the rule brings disaster. In heroic tales, this often shows up as a personal doom rule attached to a famous figure. The hero with the hound name who can't eat dog meat, the warrior forbidden to hunt a certain boar, the king whose fate collapses once he violates an animal restriction. These may be mythic echoes of older clan rules, later narrowed into the hero's personal curse, because people forgot the original social system that produced the taboo. Third, there is a strange kind of ritual memory in customs like the annual wren hunt. Across Celtic regions you find variations of the same pattern. Once a year the wren is hunted, carried in procession, treated with a mixture of celebration and mourning, and sometimes buried with solemnity. In a few places, traces suggest the bird was once eaten ceremonially. That combination is important. A creature that is dangerous or unlucky to kill at random, but is allowed, required, once a year, and then processed through the community as if its death releases a blessing. That is exactly the kind of rhythm you see in societies where a sacred animal is ritually killed at a fixed time to renew luck, health, or fertility, and where the community takes part so the benefit spreads to everyone. In the distant past, many ancient cultures imagined the sky and the earth as living beings bound together in a sacred union. Whether the early Celtic people shared this exact vision remains uncertain, yet similar ideas appear across the ancient world. In numerous traditions, heaven and earth began locked in a tight embrace, their children trapped in darkness between them. The winds, forests, and seas were sometimes imagined as their offspring, pressing outward until the sky was forced away from the earth, allowing light and life to emerge. Over time, in many mythologies, the great Sky Father faded into the background, replaced by more vivid and active gods, while the earth, steady, fertile, and close to human life, remained central. For agricultural communities especially, the earth was not an abstract force but a living presence. She fed the people, received their sacrifices, and responded to rituals meant to ensure abundance. Even when newer religions rose to dominance, older seasonal rites often survived quietly among the people, their original meanings half remembered, but their emotional power intact. If the Celts once told a story of the separation of heaven and earth, it has not survived in clear form. What remains are fragments, echoes of older cosmologies. In some traditions, the sky is imagined as supported by a mighty mountain, towering tree, or great pillars that hold the world upright. A mountain near the headwaters of a great European river was once called a pillar of the sun, said to be so tall that it concealed the sun from those who lived to the south. Such a name suggests more than geography. It hints at a belief that the heavens rested upon the land. Early Irish verse compares sacred figures to the pillars of the world, suggesting that the idea of cosmic supports lingered in poetic memory. Folklore also speaks of islands resting upon four great supports rising from the sea, or of sacred buildings upheld by pillars above frozen waters that would one day melt, swallowing everything. These stories weave together visions of creation and destruction. In other traditions, heaven and earth are linked by a bridge or ladder. Celtic lore preserves faint traces of this idea in references to a bridge of life or a bridge of heaven, suggesting a pathway between mortal existence and the divine realm. Celtic deities were not confined to a single celestial mountain. Some were associated with the sky or with peaks that seemed to touch it. Others belonged to the depths beneath the earth. The god known to the Romans as dies pater was linked to the underworld, a realm of both death and fertility. Certain divine beings were believed to dwell within burial mounds or ancient hills, while others inhabited distant, otherworldly lands across the sea. As Celtic peoples expanded toward the coasts, the realm of the blessed was sometimes imagined as an island far beyond the horizon. Sacred groves were regarded as dwelling places of divine powers who revealed themselves at midday or midnight. Rivers, springs, and trees were not merely features of the landscape, but living presences inhabited by spirits. In such a worldview, the divine was dispersed throughout nature rather than concentrated in a single heavenly court. Traditions about the origins of humanity also reveal distinctive beliefs. Rather than seeing humans as fashioned from nothing, some Celtic communities trace their ancestry to divine beings. Ancient accounts report that certain Gauls claimed descent from a powerful underworld god. This belief may reflect a myth in which humanity once lived beneath the earth before emerging into the light. The dead, in turn, return to that same divine ancestor, linking life and death in a continuous cycle. If the earth had once been imagined as a mother figure, she too could have been regarded as the source of humankind. Over time, however, the role of a maternal earth may have blended with or been replaced by that of a male underworld deity, seen as lord of both fertility and the grave. Families and clans sometimes trace their lineages to gods, sacred animals, or plants, reinforcing a sense of divine connection embedded in identity itself. Though no complete Celtic account of the creation of the world has survived, scattered traditions suggest how such stories may once have been told. Later, lore preserves memories of powerful figures shaping the land. Seas, rivers, and springs were said to arise from the actions of giants, saints, or supernatural beings. Islands were imagined as stones hurled into the ocean by colossal hands. Mountains were described as the earth piled up during titanic labours. Wells might spring forth from a staff striking the ground or from the blood of a holy figure. In these tales, saints or giants likely stand in place of far older gods, their roles reshaped as belief systems changed. One story tells of the sea itself emerging from a magical container that, once opened, could never be sealed again, its waters spreading until they covered the land. Such narratives reflect a deep awareness of floods, storms, and the unpredictable power of nature. Irish tradition speaks of new lakes and plains forming in remote ages as though the land itself were unfinished and still taking shape. Sometimes a lake appeared where a grave had been dug, the disturbance of the earth bringing forth water. These stories suggest a belief that the land was sacred and that violating it invited punishment. In several tales, a well overflowed because someone disobeyed a taboo, allowing its waters to spread across the countryside. Entire towns were said to have vanished beneath newly formed lakes because of moral corruption, the flood interpreted as divine judgment. These narratives resemble widespread flood myths found across cultures. In one Welsh legend, a great vessel preserved a man, a woman, and pairs of animals when rising waters engulfed the land, echoing a broader human fascination with destruction and renewal. Elsewhere, lakes were believed to have formed from the tears of a grieving god, linking landscape to emotion and loss. When people talk about ancient ritual killing, attention often turns first to the cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet accounts from the ancient world also describe something similar in Iron Age Western Europe. In Gaul, some observers claimed that human victims were offered in moments of crisis, in wartime, and during public ceremonies. The stated logic was stark. If danger demanded a life, then a life could be exchanged. Disease, looming defeat, or any severe threat might be interpreted as a sign that unseen powers were demanding payment. In that mindset, the person at risk could attempt to survive by substituting another life in his place. Those chosen were often people with little protection, captives, slaves, criminals, but the stories also insist that, during extreme emergencies, even close kin could be offered. If a setback suggested that the sacrifice had not been enough, desperation could intensify. The weak might be killed, a leader might present himself as the ultimate offering, or warriors might turn their weapons on themselves in a final attempt to sway fate. Whether every detail is true is impossible to prove, but the pattern described is consistent. Violence framed as negotiation with the divine. A related idea appears in tales of public burden-bearing victims used during epidemics. In these stories, a man from the poorest class would be supported by the city for a time, treated as a sacred figure in a grim sort of parade, then symbolically loaded with the community's misfortunes through formal curses and prayers. Finally, he was expelled by death. The role was not simply execution, it was transfer. Sickness, fear, and collective guilt were imagined as something that could be pushed onto a single human body and removed with it. These are the kinds of rituals found in many societies. The victim becomes a container for public disaster. War, too, could supply victims. Some traditions describe vows made before battle that promise not only loot, but human lives. Prisoners were not always treated as commodities to be exchanged. Instead, captives could be reclassified as offerings. Animals taken in raids were sometimes killed alongside human prisoners. Ancient reports list a wide variety of killing methods: stabbing, hanging, drowning, burning, even dismemberment. Different modes were sometimes associated with different divine powers. Fire for a thunder or sky force, suffocation or immersion for other gods, hanging for a power linked to trees or forests. In these accounts, the method mattered because the victim was being assigned to a realm: flame, water, air, or wood. Beyond improvised sacrifices in emergencies, some descriptions speak of periodic ceremonies that involved many victims at once. These were not private acts but public spectacles, meant to affect the welfare of an entire people. The victims might be prisoners held for long periods, criminals, or the powerless, and the killing could take place within a giant structure shaped like a human figure, built from woven branches filled with people and animals, and set alight. Whether the structure was exactly as described is debated, but the underlying theme is not. Fire as a communal offering, tied to the renewal of the year and the hope that land and livestock would thrive. In this way, the same act could be interpreted in two directions at once. It could be described as an attempt to appease angry gods, yet it also looks like a ritual meant to energize nature itself, as if life could be forced back into fields and herds by feeding the earth with blood and heat. The same sources that describe killing also describe divination. The body of the victim was not only a payment, but a message board. Some accounts claim that priests or ritual specialists watched how the victim collapsed, how limbs twitched, how blood flowed, and then turned those movements into forecasts. Others describe reading signs in the organs. In that world, the boundary between sacrifice and prophecy blurred. The killing was the ritual, and the result was information. Even when later authorities suppressed the practice, traditions suggest that symbolic versions persisted, gestures that imitated killing, a token cut, a small letting of blood, echoes of an older logic surviving under pressure. In Britain, the ancient reports grow even darker, describing blood-soaked sanctuaries and killings dedicated to a war goddess. These accounts emphasize cruelty, especially toward female prisoners, portraying sacrifice as both religious offering and terror weapon. Ireland is harder to judge because much of what survives comes from later storytelling that mixes memory, propaganda, and myth. Yet even there, the recurring themes remain. A powerful idol receiving human first offerings, a belief that prosperity demanded a terrible exchange, and stories linking sacrifice to milk, grain, and the health of the community. Some tales describe a land struck by blight and a proposed remedy that required the blood of a pure child, though the child is sometimes replaced at the last moment by an animal substitute. Whether literal or reshaped by later narrators, these stories preserve the idea that fertility and order could be repaired through blood. Another set of legends attaches sacrifice to construction. Across many cultures, there are stories that a building cannot stand until a life is placed beneath it, either to satisfy spirits of the ground or to provide a supernatural guardian. In Celtic-speaking regions, similar tales appear again and again. A holy site is sealed by a burial beneath it, or a fortress collapses until the soil is sprinkled with blood. These stories often survive in softened form, with the victim framed as a willing martyr or a saintly helper, but the structure of the myth remains. The earth demands a life before it will accept stone. If these practices were real, their deepest function may not have been simple cruelty for its own sake. In many early agricultural religions, the central fear is sterility. Fields that fail, cattle that die, families that cannot endure. In that climate of anxiety, violent ritual becomes a kind of extreme technology, a desperate method to force abundance into being. Some interpretations go further and imagine an older layer beneath the public burnings and mass killings. A time when a single victim symbolized the life of the land itself, killed so that life might return stronger, with blood nourishing soil and flesh feeding the ground. Later ages could multiply the victims, but the old meaning, fertility and renewal, would still cling to the rite. Alongside sacrifice sits another grim habit described repeatedly: headtaking. Accounts from Gaul and later Irish tradition paint the same picture. After battle, warriors returned singing, with severed heads hung from saddles or fixed on spears. Settlements could be lined with stakes crowned by skulls. Halls might store them in special rooms. Some heads were preserved in oils or locked away like trophies. The point was not money. Even when offered gold, a warrior might refuse to sell the head of a notable enemy. These heads were treated as proof of honor, a public record of courage, and a kind of personal archive of victory. But the practice also carried spiritual weight. In some traditions, taking a head was performed with gestures of dedication, as if the life of the slain was being offered to higher powers or to ancestors. A skull, placed in a sacred space, turned a trophy into an offering. Underneath this lies an old belief shared by many cultures. the head is not merely a body part. It is a seat of force, identity, and will. To possess it is to possess something of the victim's power. That may explain tales of drinking from an enemy's skull or smearing oneself with blood, acts that look like attempts to absorb strength directly. Sometimes the same logic is applied to kin, drinking a relative's blood to inherit courage or to bind the living and dead more tightly. Even later, folklore preserves an eerie shadow of it, such as stories of using the skull of a dead person as a vessel for healing rites. This obsession with the head may help explain why severed heads appear so often in Celtic art and story, not only as trophies but as protective symbols. A great hero's head might be imagined as guarding the land even after death. A carved head on a weapon or a house could be treated like a charm, a concentrated image of protective power. In such a worldview, the boundary between symbol and substance is thin. An image does not merely represent power. It can be a container for it. Not all offerings were human. Animals were widely used in ritual life, especially in contexts connected to hunting, war, disease, and seasonal change. Stories describe annual offerings, bought with money, set aside from the year's hunting, with feasting that included even the hunting dogs, crowned as if they too participated in sacred time. In wartime, captured animals could be killed for war gods, or dedicated to a river by being thrown into it, assigning them to the water's domain. In the island traditions, later religious writers often minimized or reshaped these customs. Yet traces remain. Saints' lives that describe pagan gatherings, offering victims to idols. Rural communities, killing an animal on a saint's feast day to avoid misfortune, and local rites aimed at curing madness or protecting herds. In many of these cases, a saint's name seems to stand in for an older divine figure, while the ritual continues under new language. Some of the most revealing survivals appear in folk practices during times of plague among cattle. The chosen animal might be burned and its ashes scattered over the herd, or it might be thrown into the sea or over a cliff, as if the disease could be carried away with it. Here, the animal is both payment and carrier, an offering to appease harmful forces and a vessel meant to remove misfortune. In other traditions, small animals were periodically cast out from the doorway as gifts to spirits of earth and air, a routine bargain to keep trouble away from the home. Liquids mattered too. Blood might be daubed on sacred objects, poured onto stones or trees, or collected in special vessels. Along the coasts, offerings to the sea show up in later folklore. Fishermen saluting dangerous rocks, pouring drink into the water, leaving food or cloth behind, treating the sea not as scenery, but as a living power that must be greeted. In one island ritual, a man walked into the water at night and poured a drink as an offering, while others responded with a chant asking for seaweed to fertilize the land. Afterward, silence in a church was followed by an outdoor celebration that may preserve the memory of older fertility rites. Even in recent times, milk could be poured onto certain stones as a gift to a household or herd-protecting spirit, a small act that carries the shape of ancient sacrifice without its violence. Prayer threaded through all of this. Ritual speech was likely formulaic and carefully preserved because the power of the words was believed to depend on precision. Public crisis could trigger formal curses against invaders, while leaders called on war goddesses for protection. Singing also appears as a tool. Storm-raising chants attributed to priestly women, battle songs crafted by poets, and rhythmic movements paired with the clash of weapons. These performances were not simply music. They were meant to change the world. A war cry that shouted a divine name or a clan name worked like a verbal spear, both a psychological weapon and, in the old logic, a way to compel divine attention. Dance, especially before battle or at the full moon, functioned as embodied prayer. When movement imitates action, it is often meant to influence the action itself, turning performance into a kind of magical pressure applied to reality. Divination formed another pillar of ritual life. Specialists existed, but priestly figures also practiced it, and ordinary people used simpler methods. Signs were taken from sacrificial victims, from the flight of birds, from fire and smoke, from clouds, and from the behavior of animals released for omens. Birds held a special place, especially the crow, which appears in stories as a guide, a judge, and a source of knowledge. Disputes could be settled through bird signs. Migrations could be explained as following sacred flight paths. The underlying assumption was clear. Animals did not lie, and nature itself could be read as a language. Objects were used for divination as well. Wands, rods, carved marks, and lots appear in the tradition. The technique often resembles drawing one piece at random and interpreting the signs on it, with the outcome credited to unseen guidance. Star knowledge existed too, though it likely blended simple observation with astrology. The purpose was not just to track seasons, but to choose the right moment for action. Building a house, starting an education, launching an expedition, because the timing was thought to carry power. Some methods aimed directly at altered states of consciousness. A poet-seer might eat a special piece of meat, speak words of power over his hands, press his palms to his face, and seek revelation through sleep. Another method involved composing verses and reciting them over a person or object until insight arrived. There were also incantations repeated to locate stolen cattle, or learn the length of one's life, sometimes continuing until exhaustion produced a trance. In one style of prophecy, a seer entered an intense frenzy, shouting, roaring, collapsing into ecstasy, while listeners pulled meaning from the torrent of words. When the seer returned to ordinary awareness, he might remember nothing. Traditions like this appear in many parts of the world, suggesting a shared human pattern. In extreme emotion or ritual isolation, the mind produces information in a different mode, experienced as coming from beyond the self. In the Highlands, a later practice preserved a similar structure. The seer was wrapped in an animal hide and left alone in a wild place, expected to receive dreams from spirits. The hide mattered. Across cultures, wearing the skin of a sacrificed animal is a way of crossing a boundary, using contact to draw near to the power behind the victim. Binding the seer's limbs also appears in many traditions, sometimes explained as restraint, sometimes as a way to concentrate force. The same logic shows up in healing rites, where a sick person is wrapped in the skin of a sacrificed animal, seeking recovery through contact with sacred life. The dead were also approached as sources of knowledge. People slept on graves to receive dreams, believing that the boundary between worlds thinned in such places. Stories tell of poets chanting over a tomb until a dead hero appeared and recited forgotten lore. Even the shoulder blade of a sheep could become an oracle, its marks read for signs of what was coming or what was happening far away. Nuts, acorns, and sacred trees also enter the picture as sources of inspiration, food that is not merely food, but a key to vision. Women too appear as prophets, island priestesses, ritual specialists, and later, wise women, said to foresee events. Prophecy becomes a recurring theme in heroic tales as well, with forecasts spoken at births and warnings delivered before campaigns. The word used for prophecy in some traditions suggests ecstasy rather than calm prediction, as if the future was heard during a temporary possession of the mind. Even after official religion changed, these practices did not disappear. They often shifted labels, condemned as sorcery rather than worship, yet continue because they belong to something older and harder to erase. The human need to bargain with danger, to read meaning in chaos, and to believe that words, blood, and ritual can push back against misfortune. In early Irish tradition, there existed a powerful and mysterious concept known as the geis. The word carried a double meaning. On one level, it referred to something strictly forbidden, an act that must never be committed if disaster was to be avoided. On another level, it described a binding command placed upon someone, an obligation that had to be fulfilled no matter the cost. Both meanings revolved around one idea. Invisible forces governed fate, and certain actions either protected or destroyed a person's life and honour. These prohibitions were not minor social rules. They were woven into identity itself. Some were believed to exist even before birth. Others passed down through families as if inherited along with blood and land. A few appear to preserve traces of older animal affiliations, suggesting that certain clans may once have identified themselves with specific creatures. Later, storytellers often tried to explain these taboos with dramatic legends, long after their original meaning had faded. One hero was forbidden to hunt a particular wild boar. In the tale told centuries later, the story is framed as a curse born from a tragic killing, the dead child transformed into the animal that would one day bring the hero's death. Yet behind that elaborate explanation may lie something far older, a bond between warrior and animal that could not be violated without breaking the fabric of destiny. Other figures were bound by similar restrictions. One was forbidden to eat the flesh of a dog, another could never pursue birds. Such rules seem strange today, but in a society where certain animals carried spiritual significance, breaking that bond could mean inviting ruin. Not all prohibitions were rooted in ancient animal associations. Some reflected ideas of honour and reputation. Others may have been linked to ritual calendars or unlucky times. A large number, however, concerned kings and rulers. In the early Irish imagination, a king was not merely a political leader. His body and actions were tied to the well-being of the land itself. If he observed his sacred restrictions, the fields would flourish and the cattle would multiply. If he failed, famine and misfortune might follow. The king of a province might be forbidden to appear in certain places at particular times, to wear specific colours under certain conditions, or to sit upon particular burial mounds during the wrong season. At first glance, these rules appear arbitrary, even absurd. Yet in many traditional societies, the ruler is seen as a living vessel of sacred power. His movements must be carefully regulated because he embodies the balance between nature and the human world. Every gesture carries symbolic weight. His restraint protects the harvest. His discipline safeguards prosperity. Alongside restrictions came privileges. The king might be entitled to eat certain foods on designated days or enter sacred sites, denied to ordinary people. In some cultures, the first fruits of the land can only be consumed after the ruler has tasted them ceremonially. Such customs suggest that leadership once carried ritual responsibilities far beyond administration. The king stood at the intersection of divine order and human survival, as these ideas filtered into heroic storytelling. Legendary warriors were also bound by personal prohibitions. Some of these rules seem religious in character, others appear magical. Still, others reflect deeply ingrained codes of honour. The storytellers may have added new ones for dramatic effect, but the core belief remained the same. Greatness comes with restrictions, and destiny waits for the moment those restrictions are broken. A striking feature of these obligations is that they could be imposed by anyone. A command framed as a sacred demand carried immense force. Once spoken, It had to be obeyed. To ignore it was to invite catastrophe. In the stories, such commands often sound like spells. Their power does not depend on physical strength, but on belief. The individual bound by the command feels compelled to act, even against his own wishes. There are tales of warriors driven from rest because a father-in-law demanded that they uncover a hidden injustice. There are stories of heroes forced into elopements or journeys they would never have chosen, simply because a binding demand had been placed upon them. Personal reluctance means nothing once the obligation is spoken. Fate tightens its grip. In many traditional societies around the world, the breaking of a taboo is believed to bring automatic punishment. Sometimes, the feared consequence unfolds because the individual, realizing the violation, becomes overwhelmed with dread. The mind produces the disaster it expects. Yet to those who live within that belief system, the result is not psychological, but divine. It is vengeance from unseen forces. Irish narrative tradition is filled with such outcomes. A hero ignores a sacred restriction, and soon afterward meets his death. A warrior eats forbidden food and finds that his strength abandons him at the crucial moment. The pattern is relentless. Violation leads to collapse. One of the most powerful examples is found in the story of a king whose life is bound by numerous sacred prohibitions. His rules are listed carefully at the beginning, as if preparing the audience for what is to come. Then, piece by piece, events unfold that force him into impossible situations. One rule contradicts another. A choice made to obey one restriction causes the breaking of another. The king struggles, but destiny tightens around him. By the end, he has violated the sacred code that once protected him, and his death follows in a blaze of violence. Viewed through this lens, the tale is not simply about personal failure. It carries a deeper theme. Sacred order cannot be mocked without consequence. The destruction of the king is presented as the settling of an ancient account, a delayed retribution for earlier wrongdoing within his lineage. The unseen world corrects imbalance not immediately, but inevitably. The concept of the geis reveals a society in which law, magic, morality, and destiny were intertwined. Actions were not judged solely by intention, but by their alignment with hidden forces that sustained the world. To live under such conditions meant walking a narrow path. Power brought danger. Honor required obedience. Freedom was constrained by invisible threads. In these stories, fate is rarely sudden. It approaches gradually, disguised as coincidence or necessity. The hero steps forward, believing he acts freely, yet every step moves him closer to a boundary he must not cross. Once that boundary is breached, the consequences unfold with grim certainty. Long before people in northwestern Europe began marking the year by solstices and equinoxes, time was organized in ways that matched work, weather, and survival. Among Celtic-speaking communities, the calendar appears to have started as a practical system, shaped by agriculture and herding. Later, the rhythm of the moon became central. Months could be counted by lunar cycles, and the most important measurements of time followed the night sky rather than the position of the sun. One striking habit stands out in the old tradition. Night came first. A festival began at dusk, not at dawn. The night of a holy date meant the evening before it, as if darkness opened the door and daylight followed behind. Early on, the year seems to have been divided into large seasonal blocks, tied to the movement of herds and the turning of fields. Over time, this became a more settled four-part structure, and the year began with winter, not spring. The opening point was the threshold of late autumn, a time when the warmth of the year receded and the long dark season took hold. That beginning mattered because the first day of a year is rarely just a date. It is a moment when communities try to reset fortune, drive away danger, and secure prosperity for what comes next. These major turning points were not originally anchored to astronomical markers. The great Celtic festival dates do not line up neatly with solstices or equinoxes, which suggests that the earlier system was not built around precise solar science. Yet people everywhere noticed the sun's longest days. Across Europe, midsummer developed into a major celebration with fire, procession, and communal rites. In some regions, midsummer customs look so similar to the early summer festival held at the start of May that the two appear like relatives. They may once have been different expressions of the same older season of renewal, later fixed into separate dates. In places where midsummer was already deeply established, later calendars reinforced it. In other places, older celebrations were nudged, renamed, or partly absorbed into newer religious schedules. The rituals often survived anyway, shifting onto saint days or church feasts while keeping their older shape. What survives in tradition shows that these festivals were rooted in the needs of farming and herding. People did not only celebrate, they acted. The rites were designed to protect herds from sickness, to guard households from misfortune, and to push the natural world toward growth. The ceremonies can look religious on the surface, but underneath there is often another logic: practical magic, the belief that symbolic acts can strengthen life and reduce danger. The year's opening festival in late autumn carried more than one meaning at once. It arrived as winter approached, when blight, cold, and scarcity felt near. Yet it also carried hope, because even in the dark season the promise of return mattered. That threshold seems to have gathered multiple older customs into itself. In regions where harvest happened late, the rites of gathering and storing could slide toward the autumn turning point. Even when crops were already in, threshing and final processing might still be happening, keeping the sense of harvest close to the winter gate. The festival also held echoes of an older pastoral world, when the herd was at the centre of life and winter survival depended on hard decisions. One of the clearest features of the autumn turning point was fire. A great communal blaze was kindled, and household fires were renewed from it. Old flames were put out, and new flames were carried home, as if purity had to be restored at the start of the year. In many cultures, a new fire is not simply convenient. It is a reset. It marks the casting out of accumulated trouble and the beginning of a cleaner cycle. Later, winter customs, such as the burning of special logs, and the emphasis on hearth light during the coldest season may preserve fragments of that older fire renewal pattern. Alongside the fire came forecasting. At the turning of the year, people wanted to know what waited ahead. Some divinations were tied directly to the communal blaze, using small tokens placed near it or within it to read fate. Others were more personal, often tied to marriage prospects and household fortune. The setting might change from place to place, but the purpose remained stable. The new year was an opening, and openings were dangerous. Knowledge, even in symbolic form, promised control. Another autumn custom had a blunt, practical side. Animals were slaughtered for winter food. Yet the practice was rarely treated as mere butchery. It often carried a sacred tone, and later, tradition sometimes framed it as an offering made to a holy protector. Refusing the rite could be seen as inviting bad luck. Beneath that later framing, older layers may be hiding. In early herding societies, a community might kill and share a special animal in a ritual meal, not only to eat, but to confirm the bond between people, herd, and the forces believed to guard them. Over time, as attitudes changed, the slaughter could become more general and less explicitly sacred, while still preserving the feeling that this was a meaningful act done at the right moment of the year. Other winter season customs point in the same direction. Masquerades in animal skins, processions that turned the community into a moving ritual, and smoky rites in which people and livestock were exposed to the fumes of burning hide or firebrands. Such acts often claim to drive away misfortune. They also suggest something deeper: contact with the animal, its skin, its smoke, its essence, treated as protective and potent. In many traditions, wearing the skin of a creature links the wearer to its power. Even when the old explanations vanish, the actions remain, carried forward because they feel necessary. A turning point of the year is also a moment when rules loosen. When society believes it is already throwing out evil and resetting order, a temporary surge of disorder can seem acceptable. That is why many New Year celebrations across the world allow license, noise, and excess. In Celtic-speaking regions, later accounts and folk customs still preserve hints of that atmosphere. Rowdy gatherings, pranks, and a controlled window of freedom that would be forbidden at other times. The wildness was not random. It belonged to the idea that the world was being remade. The autumn threshold was also linked to the dead. Stories and customs speak of the boundary between worlds thinning at this time. Food was set out, the unseen were remembered, and in some places they were treated as present guests. The year began in darkness, and the darkness was not empty. Fire, again, stood at the centre of protection. The blaze could be treated as a visible stand-in for the sun during the season when sunlight weakened. Lighting it on hills, carrying embers, and circling with flame could be understood as strengthening the powers of life. People leapt over fires, or past animals near them. In that ritual logic, the fire cleansed and fortified. It could also be dangerous. Folklore sometimes attaches fear to the last person near the dying flames, as if the boundary between protection and sacrifice was thin. Stories of devouring beasts, dark spirits, or unlucky fates may preserve a distant memory that someone once had to pay the price when the community demanded renewal. Over time, figures that had once been associated with growth, land, and the forces of fertility could be reimagined as threatening beings, connected with blight and winter. The same supernatural world can change its face when seasons change. A power that brings crops in spring can become a danger in late autumn. This is how old deities can sink into demon-like roles in later belief, while their festivals survive in altered form. The early summer festival that opened in May carried a different mood. It celebrated the rising strength of the sun and the return of active growth. Fire again was central, this time not as a defense against winter, but as a force to protect health and push fertility into the living world. Communal bonfires were lit on high ground, and in some traditions household fires were extinguished, so the entire district could be renewed from a single blaze. Herds were driven between fires or past the flames to keep sickness away. Sometimes the fire was set near a sacred tree or a tall green pole wrapped in foliage. The greenery mattered. It represented vegetation's presence, the living spirit of the season made visible. People moved with the fire. They danced in circles that followed the sun's path across the sky. They ran with blazing branches through fields and lanes. These were not just celebrations. They were imitations meant to cause results. If the sun's movement brought growth, then copying that movement was believed to help growth. Branches were fixed on houses for protection, and green boughs marked doors and barns as if the life of the woods could guard human life. Later, fragments of these rites preserve strange details that hint at older sacrifices. Sometimes bones or parts of animals were thrown into the flame. Sometimes a ritual chosen one appeared in the customs. A person symbolically marked, mocked, or treated as devoted during the celebration. In later times, this could be harmless play. but the pattern resembles something older and more serious. A victim once linked to the season's life force, a representative who carried the community's hopes and dangers. Even when the killing disappeared, the outline of the role could remain. Food, too, became part of the ritual. Special cakes were made and used in symbolic ways. Rolling them down slopes mirrored the sun's descent and rise, turning bread into a moving charm. In some customs, pieces of the cake were offered outward to the powers that could help or harm the herd and the flock. The gesture looks like bargaining with nature itself. The cake may also preserve an older idea. The grain is not just grain, it is life. A ritual meal is not just eating. It is participation in the season's power. Early summer also carried water rites. Wells were visited, and their water was used in ceremonies meant to bring healing or rainfall. Morning dew was treated as potent. People rolled in grass, washed faces, or collected moisture as if the year's health could be absorbed through contact with living, wet earth. Across many cultures, water, green leaves, and fire form a repeating triangle in fertility ritual. Moisture for growth, flame for power, and vegetation as the visible sign of life returning. Midsummer, when it was observed, often repeated the same pattern with even more intensity. The communal fire returned. Everyone contributed. Leaders and clergy might later appear in these gatherings, trying to place them under religious control, but the core remained older than any sermon. Dancing around the blaze, driving cattle near it, leaping through it, and reading omens from mishaps all belonged to the same belief. The fire carried the sun's force, and the sun's force could be borrowed. In many places, great fiery wheels were rolled downhill or spun as blazing circles. The symbol is obvious: the sun as a wheel of fire. Once humans had invented the wheel, it became an irresistible image for the sun's movement. Rolling it through the fields did more than imitate the heavens. It brought the charm directly onto the land. The circle moved where the crops grew. The ritual said, in action rather than words, that light and power must pass over the grain. Ashes and charred wood from these fires were treated as valuable. They were scattered on fields, kept in houses, mixed into seed, or stored for protection. Smoke drifting over farmland was imagined as a blessing, spreading the sun's strength like a veil. These practices can seem irrational now, but within their own logic they are consistent. If fire is a condensed form of the sun, then ash is the sun's residue, and the residue can be used. The festival in early August arrived as the year's first sense of harvest ripened. It became a major gathering day, not only for worship but for markets, games and social life. People met in large assemblies at central places. In later times, those assemblies were easily reshaped by new political powers and new religious calendars, but the core function remained. This was the season when work began to turn into reward. It was also a time when marriages were arranged, because food stores were growing and the community had room to breathe. In such gatherings, courtship could become more open, and festive behaviour could slide into a controlled kind of license, again tied to the belief that human vitality and Earth's vitality belong together. Behind the celebration stood an older agricultural logic. The last sheaf mattered. In many European traditions, it was treated as a living thing, preserved, honoured, given to animals, or saved for next year's sowing. That practice suggests a belief in a corn spirit, a life force that must be carried forward so the next cycle can begin. Stories later turned this into legends of deaths and burials linked to the festival, as if a figure connected to the land had to die when the harvest began. Such tales may preserve a distant memory of older rites in which a representative of the crop's power was symbolically killed, buried, or transformed, so that life could return in the next season. Across the wider ancient world, observers also described island rites and seasonal ceremonies led by women, sometimes excluding men entirely. These accounts, whatever their exaggerations, point toward an important theme. Fertility cults were often imagined as the domain of women, especially in societies where women held key roles in cultivation and household production. Ritual nudity, body paint, leafy disguises and night ceremonies appear again and again in fertility traditions worldwide. The symbolism is direct. The human body becomes an image of generative power, and exposing it, painting it, or clothing it in green becomes a way of sending that power into the fields. This is not a modern interpretation imposed on the past. It is a recurring structure that appears wherever communities tied survival to harvest. In later periods, images of goddesses or saintly figures could be carried through streets and fields when crops were threatened, accompanied by song and dance. Sometimes washing rituals were performed, as if refreshing the sacred figure could refresh the weather and the land. Eventually, relics of saints could take the place of older sacred objects, marched around newly sown fields in drought to cool down rain. The actors changed, the meaning shifted, but the need remained the same. People sought a lever that could move the sky. In the earliest layers of religion, worship rarely begins inside buildings. It begins with space, a clearing set apart from ordinary life, a boundary that marks the place as different. What matters is not stone walls or carved roofs, but the idea that a presence has claimed the ground. Once a community believes a god or spirit stands there, the place becomes charged. People approach carefully. Some areas are treated as forbidden except to specialists. Fear and reverence mix together. The worshipper does not stroll in casually. The worshipper hesitates at the edge, sensing that stepping too close could be dangerous. Across Celtic-speaking regions, the oldest sacred places were often groves. Not gardens in the modern sense, but dense pockets of woodland treated as living sanctuaries. Ancient descriptions portray them as eerie and untouchable, places where animals avoid nesting, where silence feels unnatural, where even leaves seem to tremble without wind. In such stories, altars stand among the trunks, and the images of the gods are not always statues in human form. Sometimes the god is a tree that has been shaped or scarred. Sometimes it is a rough trunk chosen and left intentionally misshapen, as if the divine is too powerful to be made beautiful. These groves are described as stained by sacrifice, marked by blood and smoke, and surrounded by tales of strange signs. Groans from the ground, sudden fires that do not consume, serpents coiled around ancient oaks. Whether every detail is literal or not, the tone is consistent. The grove is not a park, it is a threshold. War and conquest collided with these places. Roman campaigns recorded sacred woods set aside for rites, the invaders viewed as unsettling or hostile. In some cases, the response was brutal and symbolic. Cut the grove down, erase the sanctified landscape, break the power of a people by breaking the place that held their gods. Yet even after conquest, local groves did not simply vanish. They remained in the background of rural life. Long after new religions took official control, people still treated certain trees and patches of woodland as special. Laws and church penalties appear precisely because the older habits persisted. At the same time, it would be a mistake to imagine Celtic religion as nothing but woodland worship. Groves existed beside more developed sanctuaries. In some regions, especially where Celtic groups lived close to the Mediterranean world and its urban traditions, there were buildings used as temples. Some held war trophies and communal treasure. Others served as fixed places where periodic gatherings took place. Decisions, judgments, and ritual obligations tied the community's calendar. In coastal and river regions, sanctuaries could also form around water, with offerings and dedicated objects accumulating over time. Sacred spaces were not all alike. A small local grove could stand beside a large tribal centre, and both could be treated as legitimate. When the Roman world spread across Celtic lands, new temple forms multiplied. Large sanctuaries rose with Roman-style layouts, often placed where older cult sites already stood. The architecture changed, but the sacred geography frequently stayed the same. Springs, wells, and rivers became focal points for small shrines, built by individuals who believed they had received help from the resident power. Inside these temples and shrines, offerings collected. Coins, dedicated vessels, symbolic objects, trophies, and standards associated with war and protection could all be stored in sacred custody. The temple was not just a place to pray. It was a vault of sacred wealth and memory. This is also where a modern misunderstanding has to be cleared away. Stone circles and megalithic monuments are often imagined as Druid temples, complete with altars and rituals staged on flat stones. That picture has a long history in popular culture, but it does not fit what archaeology shows. Many of the most famous circles were built long before historical Celts appear in the record. They belong to much older prehistoric societies, and their primary connection is with burial and commemoration. That does not make them meaningless to later peoples. On the contrary, later communities often inherit ancient landscapes and layer new beliefs onto them. A burial monument can become a place of fear, awe, and story. People may avoid it, venerate it, or use it as a meeting place. But that is different from calling it a purpose-built temple of a later priesthood. For Celtic communities encountering these ancient structures, the safest assumption is that they regarded them as powerful because the dead were powerful. Spirits are dangerous in many traditional belief systems, especially spirits tied to old earthworks and unknown ancestors. A stone circle might become wrapped in legend. Stones that move, trees within the ring that seem alive, wells that serve as gateways to hidden worlds. These stories do not require the circle to have been built by Celtic hands. They only require the circle to exist, looming in the landscape like a relic of another age. Sacred mounds and burial places also mattered, but the evidence suggests that commemorative gatherings could cluster around certain sites without turning every monument into a temple. Some seasonal festivals gain memorial layers that link them to tombs or legendary burials. That could happen naturally when a festival is already a time of assembly. People meet, trade, compete, arrange marriages, and remember ancestors. A burial site near the gathering place becomes part of the ritual atmosphere. Still, this should not be stretched into the idea that all megaliths were centres of an official cult run by Druids. The landscape was sacred in many ways, and not all sacredness works like organised religion. Wherever the place was, sacrifice required an altar of some kind. Sometimes, that altar was nothing more than a stone heap or a single block. In other cases, it may have been a fixed platform. Large communal rites could not always be performed on an altar itself, but the altar could still be treated as the point where blood, fire, or offerings were formally dedicated. Under Roman influence, altars took on Roman shapes. Names were carved into them. Reliefs appeared. The altar became both a religious object and a public monument. Yet older altar practices likely continued alongside the new forms, especially in rural areas where stonework and inscriptions were less common. Images of the gods are another place where stereotypes get in the way. There is an old claim that Celtic religion avoided images, as if the sacred could only be felt in nature or symbol, never represented in form. The record does not support that. Images existed in multiple shapes and materials. Some were carved in wood and vanished over time because wood decays. Others were made in stone. Some were crude and rigid. Others were stylized in ways that reflect local art rather than Mediterranean realism. The idea of a deformed or stiff idol appears again and again in later writings, often as a criticism. But that very criticism implies that such objects were real and visible. It is also possible to see how images could grow out of older traditions. Standing stones placed over graves can begin as memorials, then become charged with presence. A stone that speaks in legend or that chooses a rightful king in story reflects the belief that certain objects hold power and agency. A carved tree trunk can move in the same direction. First, a sacred tree, then a marked trunk, then an image associated with a named god. None of this requires a sudden leap from pure nature worship to full statuary. It can happen step by step. Boundary stones are especially important in this story. Across many cultures, boundaries are not just lines on the ground. They are spiritual edges, places where protection is needed and where oaths matter. A stone set at a border can become an object of reverence. If outsiders arrive with their own gods of roads and crossings, they may interpret these stones through familiar categories, and the local population may adopt the connection if it feels useful. Over time, older sacred stones can receive new faces, new symbols, and new names without losing their old power. In Ireland, stories repeatedly mention idols, and not as vague metaphors. They appear as carved figures, sometimes described as adorned with precious metal. Groups of images stand together at specific sacred places, suggesting that certain sites were treated as formal cult centres. Tales of saints toppling idols fit a wider pattern seen across Europe. A new religion announces its victory by breaking the visible bodies of the older gods. Even when the stories are shaped by later belief, the repeated emphasis on images points to a world where sacred objects stood in the open and were treated as real. Britain preserves fewer detailed accounts, but later writers describe abandoned shrines filled with weathered images. The language is mournful and contemptuous at the same time, which is often the tone of a society looking back on the defeated religion of its own ancestors. The idols are portrayed as ugly, rigid, and powerless now, yet they once commanded fear. When the Roman period arrives, the amount of surviving material increases dramatically. Stone statues, reliefs, bronze figures, and small household images appear in large numbers. Some clearly represent native gods using local forms, horned figures associated with abundance, deities linked to animals, gods shown with tools like hammers or axes, protective mothers grouped in threes holding fruit or children. Other images carry Roman names, but include local identity beneath the surface, showing a blending that was common in conquered provinces. A Roman label could sit comfortably over a native personality, creating a hybrid religious language understood by locals and outsiders alike. Alongside images, symbols carried meaning. Wheels, mallets, horns, torques, cups, and cornucopias appear again and again, marking divine roles: power, plenty, sunlight, authority. Abstract signs also recur: spiral forms, triple motifs, circles, crosses, and zigzag shapes that may have represented forces like the sun, motion, or thunder. But without direct explanations from the people themselves, interpretations remain cautious. Some symbols are widespread across many cultures, which suggests that they may not belong exclusively to Celtic belief. They may belong to the shared grammar of ancient religious imagination. One especially revealing feature of Celtic religion is the treatment of weapons. In some traditions, the weapon is not only a tool, it is a vessel. Stories speak of blades that carry voices, or weapons that must be honoured with songs. Oaths are sworn on swords, and the sword is believed to punish lies. Coins show ritual scenes, a sword set upright in the earth, a warrior dancing before it, a blade presented like an idol. Even centuries later, observers describe prayers or incantations performed before a weapon planted in the ground. This is not simply military pride, it is the trace of a cult. The logic is familiar in the study of ancient religion. If a community believes a spirit can live in a weapon, then the weapon must be treated with respect. If the weapon carries a divine presence, it can witness oaths, enforce truth, and transfer power. In that worldview, a blade is more than metal. It is a charged object that links human violence to sacred authority. Later, folklore preserves the afterimage. Legendary swords that shine, weapons that choose their owners, blades that carry destiny. These are not inventions from nothing. They are the storytelling form of an older belief that sacred force can inhabit things made by human hands. The word druid has attracted speculation for centuries, partly because outsiders tried to explain it using familiar languages and symbols. Some linked it to the oak, imagining that the priesthood took its name from sacred trees. Others, looking more closely at Celtic language roots, saw something different, a title connected to knowing, seeing, and expertise. In that older sense, a druid is not simply a priest of the oak, but a figure defined by access to knowledge. That idea still echoes in later Gaelic usage, where related words come to mean sorcerer or practitioner of hidden arts. A bigger debate sits behind the word itself. Where did this institution come from, and who invented it? Ancient writers sometimes claimed that the tradition began in Britain and then crossed to the continent. Later, scholars flipped the direction and argued the opposite. The truth is harder to pin down because the ancient statements are often cautious, sometimes based on rumour, and nearly always shaped by what Roman and Greek observers thought they were seeing. One detail did stand out in antiquity. People from the continent travelled to Britain to deepen their training. That fact can be read in more than one way. It does not automatically prove that Druidism was born in Britain. It may simply mean that British schools had a reputation for being more conservative, less influenced by Mediterranean culture, and therefore more authentic in the eyes of students seeking mastery. A more radical theory claims that Druids were not Celtic at all, but the priesthood of older peoples conquered by the Celts. According to this view, the newcomers adopted the conquered religion wholesale, accepted its priestly class, and allowed that class to dominate politics, law, education, and ritual. The problem is that this is not how power usually works in conquest societies. Conquerors sometimes consult local specialists for specific rites tied to local gods. But complete submission across every area of life, with no rival priesthood resisting, is difficult to credit. Everything known about Druids in the historical record points in the opposite direction. They appear not as tolerated remnants, but as central authorities inside Celtic society itself. Descriptions of their public role are striking. Druids are portrayed as judges and arbitrators, as people who settle disputes, decide cases of violence, and impose punishments that are not merely legal but social and religious. A person who defied a druidic verdict could be cut off from communal rites and treated as untouchable. In small-scale societies, exclusion from ritual is not a symbolic penalty. It is a social death. That kind of sanction only works when the community accepts the priesthood as legitimate and powerful. Political influence appears alongside this legal power. Druids are described as figures who can restrain feuds, calm warriors, and sometimes influence the selection of leaders. In some traditions, rulers are expected to defer to the priestly voice, even in public speech. This does not mean Druids ruled alone, but it does suggest a balancing system where religious authority could check the prestige of war leaders and kings. Their authority also came from education. Druids were not only performers of rites, they were transmitters of tradition. Training is portrayed as long and demanding, lasting many years. Knowledge was taught orally and guarded carefully. This secrecy has often been romanticized as proof of advanced philosophy. But secrecy in ritual cultures does not require complex metaphysics. Sacred words are protected because people believe words have force. A formula loses power if spoken carelessly. A chant is thought to work only if learned correctly, repeated exactly, and entrusted to the right person. What did they teach? Ancient observers report that Druids offered a view of the soul that made death less final, and that this belief encouraged courage in battle. They also speak of instruction about the natural world, the sky, the structure of reality, and the power of the gods. Yet the same sources or other equally early voices emphasize a harsher reality: sacrifice, divination through blood, and rites that struck Mediterranean observers as cruel. This contradiction has fueled endless debate. The simplest explanation is that outsiders heard talk of learning and assumed it meant Greek-style philosophy, while the lived reality of druidic authority was closer to what is found in many traditional societies. A priesthood that blends religion, law, healing, and magic into one institution. That blend is important. The Druid is not easily reduced to a single modern category. In many accounts, the same worldview that supports legal judgments also supports prophecy. The same authority that teaches traditions also claims the power to alter events. Stories attribute to Druids control over weather, fertility, illness, and fate. They cast spells, raise confusion, conceal people from sight, and produce states like trance or magical sleep. Some of these motifs may be literary exaggeration, but the repetition across traditions shows what people expected such specialists to do. Healing sits within the same framework. Herbal knowledge appears repeatedly, but it is rarely presented as medicine in a modern sense. Plants, chants, timing, and ritual purity all matter. The cure is not only a substance, but an action performed correctly. Alongside Druids, other healers are sometimes mentioned, including women, suggesting that parts of this knowledge could exist outside the main priestly hierarchy, or preserve older roles in which women carried medical tradition. Ritual authority extended into life milestones. Naming rites and protective ceremonies appear in Celtic storytelling in ways that resemble baptism, not as Christian borrowing, but as a familiar human practice. Introducing a child to the community with a formal act that marks belonging and offers protection. Such rites can include water, spoken words, and symbolic gestures. They also reveal a fear of spiritual danger around birth, a time when many cultures believe unseen forces are unusually active. Death rituals also draw these figures in. Funerals in early societies tend to be moments of intense social and spiritual risk. Lamentation, offerings, and the marking of graves link the living and dead. Where sacrifice and sacred speech were central, priestly specialists would naturally be involved, whether as officiants, chanters, or guardians of correct procedure. This broad range of duties explains why ancient writers sometimes divided the learned classes into multiple groups. Alongside Druids appear diviners and poets, sometimes treated as separate ranks, sometimes as overlapping roles. In later Irish tradition, educated poets and prophets form a distinct learned class that survives more easily after Christianization, while older pagan priestly functions are pushed out or recast as mere sorcery. That shift matters for how later texts describe Druids. When a society converts, it often rewrites the past. The former priest becomes, in memory, the magician. Clothing and appearance add another layer. Some descriptions emphasize white garments, others speak of bright colours and gold ornaments. This does not have to be a contradiction. Formal ritual dress can vary by context, rank, region, and occasion. Special hairstyles or tonsures are also possible marks of office, not unlike the way many religious systems use hair to signal devotion, separation, or submission to the sacred. There is also the question of women. Later, Roman references mention female seers associated with Druidic language, and Celtic stories preserve women who prophesy, curse, and practice ritual power. In some areas, priestesses attached to specific cults are also visible, especially where a goddess is served by women, or where taboo excludes men from particular rites. In island settings and sacred enclosures, traditions describe female ritual specialists who perform divination and ceremonies that outsiders describe in dramatic terms. Some modern skeptics dismiss these accounts as fantasy, but similar patterns exist widely across cultures. Conservatism preserves older female roles in pockets, even when male priesthoods dominate most public ritual. Understanding the Druids becomes easier once the romantic extremes are stripped away. They were not harmless philosophers living as secluded sages, and they were not merely stage magicians either. They were a public institution, a learned authority woven into law, leadership, education, ritual, and the management of fear. They controlled access to sacred procedures and used social sanctions to enforce decisions. Their power was real because belief made it real, and belief was reinforced by tradition, spectacle, and the practical need for order in societies where legal and religious life were inseparable. That is also why Rome targeted them. Suppression was not simply moral outrage at sacrifice or superstition. It was political strategy. A priesthood that commands loyalty, organizes gatherings, controls judgments and shapes public belief, competes with imperial authority. Roman policy could attack the most offensive practices, restrict participation, and quietly replace Druidic influence with state-sponsored cults, provincial assemblies, and new educational institutions. Over time, this did what direct bans could not. It made the old system unnecessary for people who now had alternative sources of law, learning, and public status. In Britain and Ireland, the story plays out differently, depending on how deep Roman administration reached. In some places, Druids appear as open opponents of conquest. In others, they fade more gradually. Christianity later finishes what empire began, not only by condemning pagan rites, but by offering its own trained specialists, its own sacred texts, and its own form of ritual power. In popular imagination, the contest is often remembered less as debate and more as magic against magic. The new holy men defeating the old sacred experts by stronger spiritual force. By the time the old religion collapses, pieces of it scatter rather than vanish. Some knowledge flows into Christian practice, reshaped into blessing, exorcism, and saintly ritual. Some knowledge falls into the hands of poets, story keepers, and folk healers. Some survives as the reputation of wise women and witches, feared and consulted at the edges of village life. The institutional druid disappears, but the cultural need that once made the druid powerful does not disappear. It simply changes costume. Magic was woven deeply into the fabric of early Celtic life. It was not confined to priests or specialists, though it often gathered in their hands. Ordinary people believed in charms, spoken formulas, protective objects, and rituals that could influence health, weather, fertility, and fate. Yet above them stood figures who claimed a more disciplined command of these forces: the Druids. In many ways, the Druid was less a philosopher in the classical sense and more a ritual expert whose authority rested on mastery of unseen powers. Ancient stories portray them shaping storms, raising mists, darkening the sky, or calling down fire. In myth, entire plains are flooded by their will, armies are hidden in magical fog, and enemies are struck with terror by phantom sounds echoing through the air. These tales are not isolated inventions. They reflect a worldview in which the natural elements were alive with force, and certain individuals knew how to bend that force to their purposes. Magic was not attributed to Druids alone. The gods themselves were described as masters of transformation and illusion. In Irish myth, the Tuatha De Danann are remembered as beings of enchantment, who arrived hidden in mist and wielded extraordinary arts. Kings too were sometimes described as possessing wizard-like powers, perhaps echoing an older idea of the sacred ruler, whose authority included ritual and supernatural dimensions. Women also occupied a powerful place in this landscape of magic. In earlier forms of tribal religion, many cults appear to have been guided by women, and these traditions likely involved ritual knowledge and spellcraft. Even after Druids came to dominate public religious life, women continued to practice magic in parallel and often in secrecy. Stories speak of female figures casting spells, raising winds, changing forms, or binding men with enchantment. Christian missionaries later spoke of spells of women alongside those of Druids, revealing that female magic was feared as a living force. After the formal Druidic institution faded, the same powers did not disappear. Instead, they were reassigned. In remote regions, the ability to summon storms, heal illness with whispered words, shift shape, or turn invisible was attributed to witches. In other cases, saints and clerics inherited the same reputation. What had once been druidic became saintly. What had once been pagan ritual became miracle. Every clan or kingdom was believed to have its ritual specialists. In times of war, these figures did not merely pray, they intervened. They cast protective circles around armies, uttered spells to paralyze enemies, or conjured illusions to confuse opposing forces. Legends describe druids drying up rivers, then restoring them with a single gesture. Others boast of hurling mountains or turning trees and stones into phantom warriors to terrify invaders. Mist plays a recurring role in these stories. Armies vanish into enchanted fog. Heroes are hidden from sight. Entire invasions are said to arrive cloaked in cloud. This motif persisted in later folklore, where witches were believed to travel on winds or disappear within drifting vapours. Control over weather remained one of the most persistent claims of magical authority. In rural areas of France, Scotland, Ireland, and Brittany, long after paganism had vanished, communities processed to sacred springs during drought. Priests dipped feet into wells or sprinkled water over stones, reenacting rituals that likely once belonged to older priesthoods. Sometimes a virgin girl cleaned a holy well to restore rain. Sometimes images were washed, rocks were beaten, or water was thrown skyward in imitation of rainfall. These rites blend sympathetic magic with formal religion, showing how ancient practices survived beneath new names. Invisibility was another power frequently described. Through a special chant, a person could pass unseen or appear transformed. In some legends, saints sang hymns that caused enemies to see them as animals. Shape-shifting itself is everywhere in Celtic storytelling. Druids and magical women take on different forms. Humans are transformed into swans, deer, or hounds. Such tales may preserve echoes of older beliefs in animal ancestry or taboos against eating certain creatures. When a transformation story explains why a swan must never be harmed, it is not only fantasy, it is myth used to justify custom. Some traditions even hint at techniques resembling trance or hypnosis. Characters fall into deep magical sleep. Illusions are cast over entire armies. A person's memory can be erased through a potion of forgetting. Others are rendered motionless by a spell or compelled to speak truth while under enchanted slumber. Whether through herbs, suggestion, or ritual performance, such narratives reveal a belief that consciousness itself could be manipulated. Spoken words were central. The spell lay not in an object alone, but in the precise utterance. Certain postures were adopted to focus power. The spoken name of a god, or later of a saint, carried force in itself. Charms were guarded within families and passed down quietly through generations. In Brittany and the Highlands, healing formulas survived into modern times, substituting saints' names for ancient deities, but preserving older structures of invocation. Diseases were addressed as beings. Fertility was encouraged through rhyme. Even death could be caused by satire, the belief being that a powerful curse could mark the face with blotches or strike down the victim entirely. Music, too, held magical weight. Harps and branches from the otherworld were said to induce laughter, tears, or irresistible sleep. Fairy dances lulled mortals into trances from which they awoke to find years had passed. In ritual settings, rhythm and chant could alter emotion, leading to ecstasy or exhaustion. The boundary between art and enchantment was thin. Amulets formed another layer of protection. Small wheels, likely solar symbols, were worn as charms or cast into rivers as offerings. Fossil objects and glass beads were believed to be formed by serpents and treasured for their supposed power to win favour in disputes or gain access to rulers. Coral was prized for protective virtue. Tiny figures of animals or phallic shapes worn around the neck shielded against harm or envy. Stones used at royal inaugurations were thought to cry out under the rightful king. Pierced stones and ancient monuments became centres of healing rites. Passing a sick child through a tree split in the trunk symbolised rebirth. Sliding down sacred rocks promised fertility. Such practices belong to a universal human pattern of sympathetic magic, yet they flourished vividly in Celtic lands. When Christianity spread, it did not erase these expectations. Instead, it absorbed them. Saints were credited with dispelling storms raised by Druids, countering fire with prayer or healing through blessed stones. Stories of holy men walking unharmed through fire, calming seas, or cursing wrongdoers mirror older Druidic legends. The victory of the cross was remembered not only as theological triumph, but as magical superiority. Over time, relics replaced amulets, holy wells replaced sacred springs, and clerics replaced druids. Later still, when faith shifted again, Protestant ministers inherited similar reputations. They were said to glow with light, enter trances, pronounce curses, or prophesy events. The underlying pattern endured. The sacred specialist, whether druid, saint, witch, or minister, remained the mediator between visible and invisible worlds. Few questions have ever gripped human imagination like the fate that follows death. Across cultures and centuries, people have wondered whether the boundary of life is a wall or a doorway. Most societies have assumed that something continues, but they have not pictured that continuation in the same way. Some imagined shadowy spirits drifting in dim realms. Others imagined rebirth, or a distant paradise, or a return to the earth. Among the ancient peoples of Europe, the Celtic-speaking world stands out for the intensity of its confidence that death did not end the person. Not only did life continue, it continued vividly, almost stubbornly, as though existence simply shifted location. What makes this tradition distinctive is how physical it can feel. The next life is not described as a thin, ghost-like survival. Instead, it often appears as a continuation of embodied life in another place. The person remains the person, not a fading outline. The idea is not simply that a soul drifts on, but that identity persists with presence, movement, appetite, and recognition. That belief seems to have been strengthened by religious specialists who taught it openly and used it for social effect. Courage in battle becomes easier to demand when death is framed as a passage rather than a collapse into nothing. Yet this confident vision was not the only current flowing through Celtic belief. Beneath it lay something older, something that belongs to deep human antiquity. The sense that the dead remain close, still connected to their burial place. These two ideas can coexist even when they appear to conflict. A person can be imagined as living in a distant realm and still be treated as present at the grave. Human religion is full of such layering. New explanations do not always erase old instincts. Instead, older patterns survive inside the newer story, shaping rituals, fears, and habits. When ancient observers tried to describe Celtic views of survival after death, they sometimes reached for familiar comparisons from their own intellectual world. They spoke as though Celtic teaching matched famous Mediterranean ideas of souls moving from body to body. But that comparison can mislead. In the classical version of rebirth, the soul is often imagined returning repeatedly to this world, sometimes as a form of punishment or moral consequence, and sometimes entering even animal bodies. Celtic tradition, as it is most strongly reflected in story and practice, points in another direction. The emphasis is less on a cycle of earthly reincarnations and more on persistence beyond death in a place that is not this everyday world. The new body language can be read not as a sequence of punishments on earth, but as the idea that life continues with a complete form elsewhere. The dead do not dissolve into a mist. They remain whole. This becomes clearer when attention shifts from learned descriptions to narrative tradition. In the early stories, when the dead appear, they do not arrive as pale spectres. They arrive as people. They are described with vivid physical detail: hair, eyes, colour in the face, clothing, weapons, and the full presence of a living figure. They can ride, speak, fight, and command attention. Even their horses and chariots can seem solid. The otherworldly does not mean bodiless. It often means hidden, or brighter, or different in rules, but not less real. That same solidity clings to the beings of the otherworld, divine figures, fairy-like hosts, inhabitants of hidden realms. They feast, they make love, they quarrel, they bargain, they wage war. Their bodies can vanish from sight, and they can move in ways mortals cannot. But they are not imagined as drifting shadows. The boundary between gods, the otherworldly folk, and the honoured dead sometimes feels thinner than later religions would prefer. All inhabit a universe where embodied presence is not limited to this one landscape. Burial custom supports this outlook. Across Celtic regions, graves were not treated as empty containers for a discarded shell. They were equipped. Weapons, armour, ornaments, utensils, coins, even vehicles and chariots appear in the archaeological record. The message is consistent. The dead require tools, status, and the means to live as they lived before. Some graves suggest sacrifices made at the time of burial, sometimes grimly so. Multiple bodies appear together, or secondary skeletons appear above a richly furnished burial, lacking goods and showing signs of violence. Whatever exact interpretation fits each case, a wider assumption shines through. The dead continue, and the living act as though the dead still have needs. Story and tradition echo the same theme. Warriors are sometimes buried armed and positioned as if still guarding the frontier. The dead are not helpless. They can be imagined as an enduring threat to enemies, a permanent presence facing outward from the mound. Such ideas blur into older beliefs that treat the grave itself as a kind of dwelling. In that older layer, the dead live on inside the mound or beneath it. The tomb is not merely a marker, it is a place where the person continues to exist. Folk tradition preserves this older layer with startling bluntness. In many tales from Celtic-speaking regions, the dead rise from the grave not as airy ghosts, but as walking bodies. They may work, eat, visit households, take revenge, or demand that the living correct wrongs. Some stories even push the idea to extremes, treating the dead as physically capable in ways that are meant to shock or warn. These tales are often recorded late, but their structure is ancient because they reflect the simplest form of belief. The corpse is still alive in some sense, and the grave is not an end. Such beliefs leave traces in custom. In some areas, burial practices are shaped as if the dead might need freedom of movement. Shrouds are loosened, bindings are cut, or symbolic restraints are removed at the graveside. Later explanations often claim this is to help the spirit travel easily, but the older logic seems more material. The dead must not be trapped. The idea of movement persists even when the official theology changes. New religions reinterpret the practice, but the gesture remains. If the dead continue, where do they go? That question produced multiple answers. One answer points downward. Many peoples develop the image of a great subterranean realm, an extension of countless individual graves into one vast hidden country. Once that idea exists, it becomes easy for a fertility god of the earth, a power linked to roots and growth, to be imagined as ruler of the dead as well. The dead return to the source beneath the soil, not to be punished, but to live in abundance. A thriving underworld is not contradictory in this kind of myth. Beneath the surface, seeds germinate, roots drink, life is fed from darkness. A realm below can be imagined not as misery, but as fullness. Another answer points sideways rather than down. The dead exist in another region, a neighbouring space that overlaps this world but cannot normally be entered. This other region does not have to be on another planet or in a distant sky. It can be close and inaccessible, like a hidden valley, a hollow hill, a lake beneath a lake, or a country reached by crossing water at the right time. In such a vision, death becomes a crossing. The world is still this world, but a boundary divides it into visible and invisible territories. There is also the seductive image of distant islands, places of everlasting youth, feasting, music, and peace. Yet in Celtic storytelling, these islands are often not presented as the destination of ordinary death. They belong to gods and deathless beings. Mortals may be invited there, but usually as exceptions, often while still alive, carried away by favour or enchantment. This is important because it separates two ideas that later readers sometimes confuse: the blissful otherworld of divine beings, and the realm where the general population of the dead is believed to go. In many traditions, those two realms overlap. In Celtic material, they frequently remain distinct, even if later imagination sometimes blends them. Legends about sleeping heroes also belong in this web of belief. A great king does not truly die. He withdraws. He rests beneath a hill, inside a mountain, or in a hidden chamber with his warriors, waiting for the hour of return. This is not always framed as afterlife at all. It is framed as delay. The hero is absent but not gone. Such stories satisfy a communal hope. In the worst moment, the protector will rise again. Beneath that hope lies an older impulse. The dead remain alive and can still affect the living. The mound is not only a grave, it is a threshold. How did this afterlife look? Again and again, the picture resembles a heightened version of earthly life. Work continues, but without scarcity. Feasts continue, but without hunger. Tools are still useful. Beauty is brighter. Clothing is fine. Old affections persist, and so do old obligations. Debts can trouble the dead. Promises can follow a person beyond the grave. The living may give away food or clothing after a death with the belief that such gifts reach the departed. The dead are imagined as still social, still concerned with honour, still responsive to generosity and neglect. What is largely missing from the older material is a clear, consistent doctrine of moral judgment after death. There are hints, later and uneven, of suffering, cold, or punishment, but it is difficult to separate what belongs to older native belief from what later religions added. The early emphasis is not on ethical sorting into reward and torment. It is on continuity. Everyone goes on. Everyone remains real. The great difference is not moral status, but the quality of existence. The other life is often described as richer, freer, and more joyful than the one left behind. This helps explain another trait that ancient writers noticed with fascination: fearlessness in the face of death. When death is treated as a midpoint rather than an ending, risk changes meaning. Bravery becomes easier to demand, and self-destruction can even be romanticized or ritualized in ways that outsiders find shocking. The ideology of immortality can serve social order, warfare, and prestige. It can also comfort grief. A person is not lost. A person has changed residence. Over the centuries, official beliefs shifted. New religions came with new maps of heaven and hell. Yet older assumptions did not vanish. They survived in story patterns, in burial customs, in seasonal beliefs about the return of the dead, and in the stubborn refusal to imagine the departed as mere shadows. Even when the language changed, the underlying image remained. The dead are not thin. The dead are not distant abstractions. The dead are still persons, still present, still capable of stepping back across the boundary when the world grows quiet and the night feels thin. Some Irish stories hint at rebirth, but they do so in a very selective way. The pattern is striking. It is gods, semi-divine figures, and famous heroes who return in new forms, not ordinary people living everyday lives. That difference matters, because later copyists, writing under Christian influence, often seemed uneasy with the idea. In one manuscript, a hero's origin looks supernatural. In another, it is normalized into a more conventional birth. The result is a tradition that preserves the older imagination, but not always in a stable or consistent form. One of the clearest examples is the tale connected with Beltane. Her story moves through extreme transformations before it returns to human life. At one point, she exists in a tiny, fragile form, ends up in a drink and is swallowed. Time passes, and she is born again as a child, growing into a woman whose life becomes tangled between a mortal king and a supernatural lover who recognizes her. Yet the reborn Beltane does not carry an open memory of what she once was. The past is present in the plot, but erased from the character's awareness, as though rebirth is a return of the being, not necessarily a return of the biography. A similar logic appears in versions of the birth story linked to the great Ulster hero who is later known as Cuchulainn. The tradition does not offer one clean account but several competing shapes. In one, a woman is associated with birds and a mysterious house where a child is born under strange circumstances. In another, the same figure is raised, dies, and then returns through a more symbolic act. Something small is swallowed during drinking, and the Divine Father appears afterward to explain that a new birth is coming. The storytelling creates a double relationship. The god is father, but also in some sense becomes the child. It is not a philosophical system spelled out in abstract language. It is myth thinking in images, where a divine power can both remain itself and also re-enter the world through a human birth. Other tales push the idea even further by turning rebirth into a chain of animal lives. In one famous narrative, two rival herdsmen tied to the supernatural world fight through a sequence of transformations, shifting from creature to creature until they become small, crawling forms that are swallowed by cattle. The cattle then give birth to two great bulls, whose conflict becomes the spark for a major heroic saga. Here, rebirth does not serve personal salvation or moral justice. It serves mythic causation. It explains why certain animals feel larger than nature, as if they carry an older identity within them. There are also stories that sit on the borderline between magic conception and rebirth. A woman drinks from water that contains something living, often described as a worm or tiny creature. After that, she becomes pregnant, and the child is born with a sign that links him to the strange origin. These stories do not always say outright that a god was reborn. Sometimes they leave it as rumour or wrap it in an explanation that sounds like a folktale motif. Yet the structure invites a deeper reading. A river spirit, a well spirit, or a hidden power associated with water may be entering human life through a swallowed form. In older mythologies across the world, water is not only a setting. It is a doorway where the boundary between worlds becomes thin. A hero's identity can also drift across time in more political or legendary ways. One story presents a later king as someone who carries the identity of a much older champion, and another links that same king to a sea god who intervenes in battle and claims him as a child. The tradition does not care that these versions collide. Myth does not behave like a modern family tree. It layers meanings. A king can be a historical person, a divine child, and a legendary rebirth depending on which story is being told and what that story wants to prove. Something else appears in these narratives as well. The belief that supernatural beings can father children with humans, leaving part of themselves behind in the child. That idea is not unique to Ireland, but Irish material preserves it vividly. A mortal meets a radiant woman from the Otherworld and is taken away. A hero is offered love by a powerful goddess. A young man is called toward a land of promise by an unseen voice. In such scenes, the boundary between divine and human is not absolute. It is negotiated through desire, bargaining, and danger. Later, Christian writers often turn these beings into darker figures, not the great gods of old, but shaggy or restless spirits, who tempt and trouble women at night. That shift shows how a religion can keep the shape of older belief while changing its moral meaning. Alongside rebirth, the tradition is saturated with another theme: transformation. Druids, poets, and supernatural figures claim the ability to change form, or at least to speak as if they have lived through many forms. Some of this is pure poetic style, bold metaphor, fierce self-description, dramatic bragging meant to dominate an audience. Yet it also reflects a world where shape is not a prison. A person can become a beast, a bird, a fish, a gust of wind, a wave, or a weapon in the imagination. And the imagination is not treated as harmless fantasy. It is treated as a kind of power. Some texts present the claim as "I am," followed by a list of forces of nature and animals, like a chant spoken by someone who wants authority over land and sea. Other texts prefer "I have been," as if the speaker is remembering a long chain of existences. The boasting can be read as performance, but performance usually grows from belief. The point is not pantheism or philosophy. The point is the old magician's claim: reality is flexible, and the right knowledge can cross its borders. A later Irish example reveals how these ideas could be rearranged to serve new purposes. A story describes a man who survives from the earliest invasions of Ireland to the age of saints by repeatedly waking in a new animal form: stag, boar, hawk, salmon. Finally, he is eaten and is born again as a human, remembering every stage. This was likely shaped by Christian writers as a clever framework for preserving a long timeline. Yet it almost certainly borrows older building blocks: the belief in long-lived beings, the transformation chain, and the final return to human birth through swallowing and rebirth. This is where the myths begin to tangle. Is the core idea transformation, meaning a temporary change of shape? Is it transmigration, meaning a soul moving into a different body? Or is it rebirth, meaning a fresh birth that carries an older identity? The stories often merge these possibilities instead of choosing. A tiny creature swallowed in drink can be read as a transformed god, or as a soul in animal form, or as a symbolic seed of life. Folklore rarely polices definitions. It uses images that feel convincing to the culture that tells them. Later, folk belief across Celtic regions offers clues to why these images work. In some places, the souls of the dead are imagined as birds. Elsewhere, they appear as butterflies, moths, or small flying creatures. Some traditions say that the wicked or the restless take animal forms, and certain animals become taboo because they are thought to carry human souls. In that atmosphere, it is easy to see how an outsider could conclude that rebirth was a general doctrine. Yet the stories themselves suggest something narrower and more mythic. These transformations and returns are mainly for exceptional beings, and they function as narrative tools rather than as a universal rule for all humans. There is another idea beneath the surface that helps explain the recurring imagery of insects, worms, and tiny creatures. In many societies, the soul is imagined as a small living thing that can leave the body in sleep, illness, or trance. If a culture already imagines the soul as something small, mobile, and animal-like, then it becomes easier to imagine it entering another body, being swallowed, or returning through birth. A belief about the shape of the soul can easily be mistaken for a doctrine of full reincarnation, even if the community never built a consistent theology around it. What emerges then is not a single Celtic system of rebirth taught to everyone, but a cluster of older ideas that feed the mythology. Shape-shifting, strange conceptions, divine fatherhood, heroic returns, animal life chains, and memory that sometimes survives and sometimes vanishes. These motifs may have coloured what classical observers reported, especially if those observers were searching for familiar categories and found only partial echoes. Across the Celtic world, especially in Irish and Welsh tradition, there survived a powerful vision of a radiant Otherworld, a place later compared to Elysium. Although direct evidence from the continental Celts is scarce, the strong similarities between their beliefs and those of the Celtic peoples of Ireland and Britain make it likely that they too imagined such a realm. This Otherworld appears in several distinct but overlapping forms. Sometimes it lies beneath the hills, hidden within the mysterious mounds. Sometimes it stretches far to the west across the sea, a distant island beyond the horizon. In other tales, it exists beneath the waters, and in yet others it surrounds the human world invisibly, concealed within mist. The Irish gave many names to this realm. It was called the Great Plain, the Pleasant Plain, the Land of the Living, the land of youth, or the land of promise. Certain islands were identified with it, including lands said to lie under waves or far beyond Ireland's western shores. Some traditions even linked it with the Isle of Man, suggesting that early Celtic settlers may once have regarded real places as entrances to a supernatural paradise. Over time, stories carried heroes back and forth between Ireland and these enchanted regions, blending geography with myth. A brief survey of the main types of these stories reveals how richly imagined this realm was. One version places it inside the sacred mounds. In such tales, a hero or heroine is invited into a hidden world filled with music, warmth, endless feasting, and unending youth. Love there is free from blame, and sorrow has no place. Yet this underground paradise is not unreachable. A king or druid may discover its entrance. Mortals may enter and even conquer it, though its splendour surpasses anything known on Earth. Another form describes a Western Island paradise. In one famous voyage, a hero hears unearthly music and is given a silver branch heavy with blossoms. A mysterious woman appears and sings of a land across the sea where pain and death are unknown. He sails westward and encounters a divine figure who explains that what appears to be ocean is in truth a flowering plain invisible to mortal sight. The voyagers reach islands of joy and finally a land ruled by beautiful women. Time passes there like a dream. Food and drink satisfy every desire. Yet longing for home returns. When they attempt to step once more onto Irish soil, disaster follows. One man turns to ashes the moment he touches the ground. The hero himself speaks of his wanderings and then vanishes forever. Other tales follow a similar pattern. A goddess may offer a hero an apple that never diminishes, sustaining him without loss. She invites him to dwell among the ever-living ones in a realm free from decay. Sometimes a mortal remains there for centuries without aging. Upon returning home, he discovers that generations have passed. Breaking a single taboo, placing foot upon the earth, causes age to fall upon him instantly. In some narratives, the otherworld lies beneath lakes or seas. Warriors dive into a lake and emerge in a radiant country where rain falls as ale and music fills the air. There, they fight alongside supernatural allies against rival divine hosts. After a year, they grow homesick. They are warned not to dismount when they return to Ireland. Yet even after seeing their own people again, they ride back into the waters and are never seen again. Another vision presents the otherworld as overlapping the human realm. A mist rises, and within it stands a magnificent hall. A divine host receives a mortal guest. Magical animals are slaughtered and restored to life. Cups shatter at lies and mend at truth. Enchanted branches produce music that drives away sorrow. By morning, the hall has vanished, and the mortal finds himself back in his own dwelling, uncertain whether he has crossed into another world or whether that world had briefly crossed into his. Welsh tradition preserves related images. The otherworld, known by a name later associated with the abyss, is in fact a beautiful land ruled by a king engaged in warfare against a rival. It is a place of feasting and splendour, not a gloomy underworld. In later legends, it is imagined both beneath the sea and across it. It contains cauldrons of inexhaustible nourishment and wells sweeter than wine. In Arthurian tradition, a blessed island where eternal spring reigns becomes the final resting place of the wounded king. There, he is healed by a radiant queen attended by otherworldly maidens. Over time, real places such as Glastonbury became linked with this enchanted isle, their ancient names suggesting orchards, glass-like waters, and shining landscapes. The roots of this belief likely reach back to universal human ideas of a lost golden age, a place where mortals once lived in harmony with divine beings. Among the Celts, this idea seems to have taken two paths. One may have been a joyful realm of the dead beneath the earth. The other was a distant paradise not reserved for the dead, but accessible to favoured heroes during life. In surviving tales, the second vision dominates. The Otherworld is not the abode of departed ancestors. It is a realm of gods and supernatural beings, who invite chosen mortals to dwell among them. Some have argued that these lands were simply the Celtic version of the afterlife. Yet the stories consistently describe them as places entered by living heroes, not by the souls of the deceased. The inhabitants are not dead relatives, but divine hosts. Mortals are invited, tempted, or enchanted into crossing over, not summoned after death. A defining feature of this realm is immortality. Its people never age or sicken. Yet this deathlessness often depends upon food or drink. Magical swine return to life after being eaten. Ale confers vitality. Apples never diminish and grant youth to those who partake of them. Crimson nuts fall into sacred wells and bestow wisdom upon those who taste them. Rowan berries restore strength and lengthen life. Across many cultures, food sustains life. It is therefore natural that imagination transformed this truth into the belief that a divine food could sustain life forever. Eating the fare of the otherworld binds the mortal to it. To accept such nourishment is to become kin with its people. Once the bond is formed, return to the human world becomes perilous or impossible. The trees of this realm are wondrous. Their branches gleam like silver. Their fruit produces music. Birds in their boughs sing melodies that bring healing sleep. Sometimes a branch from such a tree serves as a talisman, guiding the hero across the threshold between worlds. The symbolism of sacred trees and sacred groves likely shaped these images, for what is revered on earth is often imagined in perfected form among the gods. The inhabitants of this realm are unseen at will. A goddess may be visible only to the hero she has chosen. A divine figure may stand among mortals unnoticed by all but one. Shape-shifting is common. Women become birds. Warriors pass invisibly through mist. Among the most striking symbols of this otherworld is the magical cauldron. It never empties. It restores life, it grants inspiration, it satisfies every guest. Such vessels likely echo ancient rituals of fertility and sacrifice. In later legend, heroes steal these cauldrons from supernatural lands, bringing fragments of divine abundance into the mortal sphere. Over time, this motif influenced medieval romance, where a sacred vessel bestows nourishment and healing upon the worthy. Stories also tell of cattle and other animals taken from supernatural lands. These tales may preserve memories of a time when domestication itself was viewed as a divine gift. The idea that culture, livestock, and knowledge originated among the gods and were seized by heroes reflects a deep belief that civilization descends from sacred sources. Love plays a central role in these narratives. Divine women lure mortal men to enchanted islands where love is described as free from wrongdoing. Islands of women appear again and again in Celtic storytelling, perhaps echoing ritual traditions or ancient seclusions. Whether born of memory or imagination, these islands heighten the sensual and emotional appeal of the otherworld. Music also fills this realm. Harps, birds, and even stones produce melodies of surpassing sweetness. No harsh sound intrudes. The land is described in glowing detail: green plains, blue hills, silver rain, white cliffs shining in sunlight. Such passages reflect a people deeply sensitive to landscape and atmosphere. The beauty of the Celtic lands, mist, sea, and sunset, flows directly into the vision of paradise. The rulers of this realm vary. Sometimes a sea god presides over the western island. Sometimes a lord of the mounds governs his hidden domain. The setting sun may have suggested a distant divine resting place beyond the ocean horizon. From cliffs facing the west, it is easy to imagine another world lying beyond the shimmering line where sea meets sky. Over centuries, this divine land gradually transformed into fairyland in popular belief. The gods became fairies dwelling in hills and mounds. The enchanted realm remained beautiful and timeless, but its inhabitants shrank in stature and stature alike. Later, Christian voyages reimagined these western islands as heaven, purgatory, or hell. Yet even as Christian theology reshaped the imagery, traces of the older vision endured. The land of promise became identified with the heavenly kingdom, and paradise itself absorbed something of the Celtic dream. Despite its sensuous delights, food, music, love, the Celtic Otherworld also carries a spiritual longing. It promises freedom from grief and strife. It offers peace without decay. Mortals who glimpse it often prefer it to kingship or glory. Its appeal lies not only in pleasure, but in harmony, beauty, and rest.